Hello there, and welcome to Just Core of Earth, where curiosity slows down, science takes its shoes off at the door, and we wander into the quiet corners of history that most people forget about. Tonight's journey is going to be a little darker than usual, but still gentle, still steady. The kind of story you can lean back with as your thoughts soften. We're going back to a time when Earth had nearly emptied itself of life, when silence carried across oceans, and when the future of every creature, including you and me, balanced on a thin edge. It was the aftermath of the Great Dying, the biggest extinction event our planet has ever endured. Now, I know extinction is a heavy word. It sounds final, unforgiving, and absolute. But what makes this story worth telling is not the end. Is what happened after? Because life did not give up. It changed. It shrank. It stumbled. It adapted in strange and sometimes awkward ways. And eventually, it reshaped the world into something new. So tonight, instead of staring at the catastrophe itself, we'll linger in the silence that followed in the millions of years, where life was stripped down to almost nothing, and then had to figure out how to rebuild from the ground up. But before we get too deep into ancient oceans and forests that weren't really forests anymore, I want to pause and ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? And what's the weather like outside your window? It's such a small thing, but I always like to imagine the scatter of people across the planet, each in their own little moment, tuning into the same story. Maybe it's night where you are. Maybe it's bright afternoon. Maybe it's raining, and you can hear the drops as you settle in. Whatever it is, thank you for being here. If you find this little corner of calm a nice place to return to, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or maybe subscribed. It helps us reach others who might want to slow down and wander with us too. So, with the kettle of curiosity on the stove and no rush at all, let's step quietly into a world most of us can hardly imagine. The time just after the Great Dying, when Earth was raw, battered, and trying to breathe again. Picture this. 252 million years ago, give or take. The Permian period ended not with a whimper, but with a cataclysm. Volcanoes tore open the crust in what's now Siberia, belching fire, smoke, and gases for thousands upon thousands of years. Oceans turned acidic, skies filled with toxic haze, and nearly every familiar form of life vanished. Around 90% of marine species and 70% of land species were gone. Entire forests gone. Coral reefs gone. The insect world, which had thrived for hundreds of millions of years, collapsed too. It was the closest our planet has ever come to being reset, almost scrubbed clean. But the moment I want you to imagine isn't the disaster itself. It's what came after. Imagine waking up in that world. Not as a human, because humans were still hundreds of millions of years in the future, but as one of the few creatures left alive. Imagine stepping into a landscape where trees had fallen silent. Rivers ran sluggish with ash, and the air carried a tang that burned the throat. The soundscape would have been strange, too. Birds didn't exist yet. Insects were almost gone. The usual buzz, chirp, and rustle of life had thinned into something eerily quiet. The earth itself felt heavier, slower, wounded in a way that only time could repair. The Great Dying wasn't a single moment. It was stretched out over thousands of years, maybe even longer, with waves of destruction that ebbed and flowed. That means there was a clean break where one day everything was fine and the next it was empty. Instead, it was a long unspooling of loss. Imagine living through that. Imagine generations of creatures slowly noticing fewer neighbors, fewer plants, fewer places to hide, fewer chances to find food. And then, after the last waves of extinction finally passed, the survivors found themselves in a stripped-down world that barely resembled the one their ancestors had known. If you've ever walked into a burned forest, you might know a little of the feeling. Charred trunks, blackened soil, silence where there should be birdsong. Multiply that by an entire planet, and you have a faint sense of the aftermath. And yet, even then, life clung on. A handful of tough species made it through. Some were small, some were sturdy, some were just lucky. They would become the starting pieces in a long, slow puzzle of recovery. But let's not run too far ahead. Let's linger a little longer in the strange quiet that followed. Because it's in that quiet where you can really feel the weight of what happened. Imagine standing on the shore of what used to be a reef. Only now it's barren. The water is murky, filled with suspended minerals with oxygen levels too low to support much. Fish are rare. Corals are gone. The seafloor is coated in microbial mats, thick and slimy, the kind that usually get overshadowed when ecosystems are healthy. In a way, the oceans had regressed. They weren't bustling highways of fish and mollusks anymore. They were more like ancient ponds from Earth's early days, dominated by bacteria and algae, sluggish and simple. On land, it wasn't much better. The great forests of the Parian had collapsed. And for a while, Earth entered what scientists sometimes call a coal gap. That means there simply weren't enough trees to form new coal deposits. Whole ecosystems of plants had been wiped away. The ground would have been barren in many places, dotted with hardy shrubs and ferns struggling to re-establish themselves. Soil itself was unstable, washed easily into rivers without roots to hold it down. Floodplains turned muddy, erosion was rampant, and the air was often thick with dust. If you had walked across that land, you wouldn't have heard much. Maybe the shuffle of a few reptiles, the croak of an amphibian, the wind sweeping across open ground. No chorus of insects, no bird calls, no thick cover of greenery to rustle in. The silence would have been heavy, almost uncomfortable. And yet, for all its emptiness, this world was not truly dead. It was fragile, yes, but there were sparks left. And those sparks would eventually kindle into something entirely new. I want to pause here again just for a moment to think about scale. When we talk about recovery after the Great Dying, we're not talking about decades or even centuries. We're talking about millions of years. Imagine trying to measure recovery on a scale where even an entire human civilization, from its first fires to its tallest skyscrapers, is just a flicker. The Great Dying ended, and then Earth took 5 million years before ecosystems even began to resemble stability again. That's 5 million years of stumbling, of trial and error, of collapse and regrowth. And if you zoom in on any tiny piece of that recovery, you'd find lives playing out in the ordinary way. Creatures eating, hiding, reproducing, and dying. But zoomed out, it looks like Earth itself taking deep, shaky breaths after nearly suffocating. Think of how slow that is. If you've ever felt impatient waiting for water to boil, imagine waiting not minutes, but entire epochs for forests to regrow and oceans to clear. That's the tempo we're dealing with. And it's humbling, isn't it? To realize that our sense of time is so quick, so focused on hours and days, while Earth measures its recovery and spans longer than all of human history combined. But we'll get into that recovery more as we go along. For now, let's stay with this first picture. The world immediately after the Great Dying. A world of silence, of emptiness, of stubborn survivors clinging on in the margins. It's easy to imagine it as hopeless. But what's fascinating is that it wasn't, because those survivors, those few tough creatures were enough. From that fragile starting point, life would slowly, painfully, and eventually beautifully begin again. If you try to picture what Earth looked like the very day after the Great Dying, you might be tempted to imagine something dramatic, like a movie scene where the credits roll after chaos. But what really followed wasn't a clean moment of silence. It was more like the tail end of a storm that refuses to let go. The skies had been choking with ash and gas for centuries. Volcanoes in Siberia had poured out lava not for a season, not for a human lifetime, but for hundreds of thousands of years. That alone is hard to wrap your mind around. Imagine Mount Vesuvius erupting for as long as humans have been farming. Then multiply that until your brain gives up. That was the scale of destruction. By the time the final bursts of that activity were calming down, the Earth had already changed so thoroughly that there was no familiar balance left. The morning after, if we can call it that, wasn't crisp or refreshing. It was heavy. The air would have felt thick, maybe even poisonous in many places. Carbon dioxide levels were many times higher than anything we've ever experienced as a species. Methane had spilled into the air too, and ozone was weakened, so sunlight would have felt harsher, more punishing. Breathing was difficult for many creatures, and for some, it was impossible. Oxygen had dropped to a fraction of what it had been before. In fact, geologists estimate that oxygen levels might have dipped to about 16% of the atmosphere. If you've ever been short of breath at high altitude, imagine that feeling spread across the entire planet. The land carried scars everywhere. Whole forests had collapsed. Tree roots rotted in the ground, releasing yet more carbon. Coal deposits that had once been forming in lush wetlands simply stopped appearing in the rock record. To modern scientists, that absence is like a blank page in a diary. It tells us there were no great forests weaving carbon into wood anymore. No massive ecosystems of plants building the kind of landscapes that last for ages. Instead, the earth was dotted with patches of hardy survivors. Ferns tried to reclaim bare soil. Scraggly shrubs clung to any patch of ground they could find. But there was no wide canopy, no dense jungles. Without roots to hold the soil, floods stripped away the earth during storms. Rivers swelled with mud and seas filled with silt. Imagine standing on a hillside and watching the rain wash away the ground itself, leaving barren stone where once there had been greenery. That was a common sight. And what of the animals? The ones that survived weren't the great diverse caste that had filled the Parian. Most groups were reduced to a few stragglers. Amphibians still lingered. Some reptiles too, but the rich variety was gone. The world felt emptier, both in number and in kind. There's an eerie loneliness in imagining that. Think about walking through your neighborhood, but finding every house empty, every park silent, every street bare. The structures remain, but the life that gave them meaning is gone. Earth after the great dying was like that. The rocks, rivers, and mountains were still there, but the busy chatter of life was almost entirely absent. The oceans had suffered even more. Acidification had eaten away at shells and corals. Coral reefs, which had been the bustling cities of marine life, were gone, entirely gone. That absence lasted for millions of years. The water itself was strange, often stagnant with little oxygen circulating to the depths. In many places, the seafloor was covered in black sulfuric sediments, giving off a rotten smell if disturbed. Microbes thrived in those conditions. Mats of them covering rocks where fish and invertebrates once swam. If you had dipped your hand in, you would have pulled it out coated in slime. The oceans had lost their sparkle, reduced to soup, where only the simplest and most stubborn creatures could endure. It's worth remembering that not all the survivors were graceful. Some of the animals that pulled through looked almost comical to our eyes, but they had exactly the qualities needed. Toughness, generalist diets, adaptability. Among them was Listoris, a squat tusked reptile that looked something like a pig with a turtle's attitude. Not glamorous, but resilient. Fossils show that in the immediate aftermath, these animals made up as much as 90% of some fossil beds. Imagine a world where nearly every moving thing you see is a variation of the same snub-nosed, barrel-bodied creature trudging through mud. That's what the land was like. The day after extinction wasn't quiet because everything had ended. It was quiet because so little was left. That's a subtle difference. Extinction doesn't erase the earth. It strips it down. It leaves behind pockets of survivors that must make do with less food, harsher air, emptier spaces, and its silence can be louder than any eruption. Imagine listening for birdsong and hearing nothing, waiting for insects to buzz in the grass and realizing there are none. standing at the edge of the sea and seeing only waves rolling onto barren shores. The soundtrack of life had been turned down so low that you could hear the planet itself breathing, shifting, eroding, and waiting. In that silence, the world looked alien. The colors had changed. Without great forests, the landscape wasn't the deep green we're used to. It was pale, brown, gray, with occasional patches of fern spreading like mats over the ground. Skies carried a yellow tint in many regions from lingering haze. Water ran murky and brown with silt. Even the air might have looked different, heavy with dust or mist from evaporating seas. If you had stood there, you might not have recognized it as Earth at all. And yet, this was the same planet just caught in its hardest moment. There's something humbling about imagining that day. Because when we look at fossils and data today, we see the scars, but also the persistence. We know that while so much vanished, some hung on, and their quiet survival became the seedbed for everything that came after. Dinosaurs, mammals, birds, even us were only here, because in that barren world, a few creatures kept walking, eating, burrowing, reproducing. They weren't planning the future. They weren't even aware of how fragile things were. They were just alive. And sometimes that's enough. What fascinates scientists is how uniform the survivors were. After such a massive loss, the diversity of life had collapsed. Before, ecosystems had been layered and complex, filled with specialists. Afterward, it was like the entire cast of a play had been replaced by understudies reading from the same page. Simple food webs dominated. Fewer predators, fewer prey, more generalists. It's as if nature had pressed the reset button, and the first attempt at rebuilding was crude and unpolished. That's what the day after extinction felt like. The beginning of a long rehearsal for a play that wouldn't be ready for millions of years. If you try to put yourself there, it's worth asking, what would it feel like to be alive then? For a creature like Lyssaurus, life was probably exhausting. Heat was intense, food was scarce, competition was fierce. Many would not survive long. For amphibians, the waters they depended on were unstable, sometimes drying, sometimes poisonous, even for microbes, which seemed to flourish. Conditions swung wildly. The earth itself seemed restless with climates flipping back and forth. One season might scorch, the next might flood. Imagine living without the comfort of predictability, without any rhythm you could count on. That was daily life after the great dying. And yet, in the cracks of that hardship, resilience grew. Some creatures found ways to burrow into the ground, escaping the harshest heat. Some shifted diets, nibbling on whatever remained. Plants learned to spread quickly, reclaiming barren soil before it washed away. Even microbes innovated, creating new chemical cycles that slowly helped balance the seas again. All of this was happening quietly, invisibly, day after day, year after year. While the world still looked empty, the silence of that day wasn't truly empty. It was full of invisible labor, life testing the limits of what it could do. From our perspective, looking back, we can see that day as the pivot between an old Earth and a new one. The Permian had ended, and with it entire lineages of life. The Triassic was beginning, though no one alive then knew it. And in that beginning was uncertainty, fragility, and a kind of eerie stillness. But beginnings often feel that way. The first steps are always wobbly. The important thing is that they happened. And so if you imagine yourself standing in that world in the aftermath, you'd be looking at something both heartbreaking and astonishing. Heartbreaking because of what was lost, astonishing because of what still remained. A handful of survivors in a battered world carrying with them the possibility of everything yet to come. That possibility was small, fragile, and stretched thin, but it was enough. And that is where the story of recovery begins. In the silence of the day after extinction, when the world was stripped down to its barest bones, and still somehow it kept going. When people picture ancient oceans, they often imagine them much like the ones we know now. Blue expanses teeming with life just beneath the waves, schools of fish darting, reefs bustling, predators cruising. But after the great dying, the seas were not seas as we would recognize them. They were broken, unstable, stripped of their richness, and in many places almost dead zones. To think of them as oceans at all might be misleading. They were more like giant suffocating basins of water trying to remember how to support life. The catastrophe had unfolded in layers, and one of the cruelest was what happened underwater. The eruptions in Siberia had released such staggering amounts of carbon dioxide that it dissolved into the seas, forming carbonic acid that made the water corrosive to shells and skeletons. Imagine an ocean where the very act of having a shell becomes a liability because the water eats it away. Creatures that had spent millions of years building protective armor suddenly found that armor melting. Corals collapsed, shelled mollusks withered. The very architecture of marine ecosystems fell apart. And with forests gone on land, soil washed straight into rivers, filling the seas with silt. Oxygen was already low, but now layers of water became stagnant. In many places, the surface held a thin skin of life, but below that, it was deprived of oxygen. The deeper layers turned toxic, filled with hydrogen sulfide produced by bacteria. If you had looked into those waters, they might have shimmered green or purple with bacterial blooms, the kind we sometimes see today in polluted lakes. Only this wasn't a small pond at the edge of town. This was entire oceans shimmering with the colors of microbial overgrowth. For marine animals that needed oxygen, it was like trying to live in a suffocating blanket. Many simply couldn't. Fish populations collapsed. The reefs, which had once been coral palaces buzzing with invertebrates, were empty rubble fields. For millions of years, there would be no true reefs. That gap in the fossil record is one of the most haunting signs of how deep the collapse was. Reefs today are considered delicate, but they're also ancient survivors. For them to disappear completely tells you how harsh the conditions became. In place of those vibrant ecosystems, microbial mats spread. These mats were slimy communities of bacteria that covered rocks and seafloors, forming slippery blankets where corals once built skyscrapers of stone. They were successful in their own way, thriving in conditions where others failed, but they offered little structure or shelter for more complex creatures. It was like replacing a bustling city with a carpet, flat, monotonous, and unwelcoming. The oceans also warmed with greenhouse gases thick in the air. Global temperatures soared, and the seas absorbed much of that heat. Warm water holds less oxygen than cool water. So the problem deepened. Even in shallower areas, oxygen levels fluctuated wildly, making survival unpredictable. If you were a fish or an invertebrate, you might find a pocket of livable water one week, only to find it unbreathable the next. Entire populations could blink out between generations, not because predators ate them, but because the chemistry of the water itself betrayed them. When scientists study rocks from that period, they find signs of these unstable conditions. Layers of black shale rich in carbon tell the story of low oxygen seas where organic material piled up without breaking down. Other layers show chemical fingerprints of hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg gas that is poisonous to most complex life. Together, they reveal oceans that were less like the open blue we know today and more like vast hostile cauldrons. And yet, even in that grim picture, life found ways to endure. Some groups of bivalves managed to hang on. A few species of brachiopods, too, though their glory days were behind them. Tiny plankton drifted in the upper layers of the seas, forming the beginning of food chains that struggled to hold together and in the absence of corals. Other reef-like structures slowly began to form from sponges and microbial communities, though they were crude and patchy compared to what had come before. It's easy to think of this as hopeless, but from another perspective, it was a reset. The oceans had become laboratories of survival, testing which traits could handle heat, acidity, and low oxygen. Those that passed the test would shape the seas for millions of years to come. One of the key lessons seems to have been flexibility. Creatures that could tolerate wide swings in conditions, or that could thrive in marginal niches, did better. Specialists, those that had evolved to fit one narrow role, were wiped away. The ocean, once finely tuned, was stripped back to generalists. Imagine floating on those waters. The surface might look calm, reflecting the sun just as it does today. But beneath the layers would tell a different story. Shallow zones clouded with algae, deeper zones thick with purple and green sulfur bacteria. Beyond that, black stagnant water where almost nothing could survive. In some regions, whole columns of water may have been poisonous from top to bottom. And yet, even in that chaos, plankton swirled, crustaceans clung on, and survivors swam sluggishly through the thin band of water where conditions allowed. Over time, these survivors began to spread. Slowly, cautiously, they filled in the spaces left empty. But it was not a quick recovery. Reefs, once vibrant hubs, took about 5 million years to reappear in anything resembling their former glory. For all that time, the seas remained quieter, simpler, dominated by microbes and a handful of hardy animals. If you had visited Earth, then you might have found the land unsettling. But the oceans would have been stranger still, vast, silent, and oddly monotonous, like a world stripped of its color and sound. And yet, these oceans were not empty promises. They were the foundation for what would come. Within them, new lineages began to take hold. Early ancestors of modern fish, new kinds of mollusks, sponges that would eventually help reefs return. The seas were like a blank canvas waiting for brushstrokes. The old masterpiece had been erased, but the frame was still there, ready to be filled again. It would take patience on a geological scale, but the painting would return different this time, with new themes and brighter hues. If you trace that line forward, you realize something remarkable. The very emptiness of those oceans made room for the rise of new giants. The ancestors of the great marine reptiles of the Triassic, the echosaurs and plesiosaurs, would soon find their stage here. Fish would diversify again. Corals, after their long absence, would re-evolve into new forms. The seas that seemed broken beyond repair would become rich again. But on that first stretch after the great dying, they were shadows of themselves, still heavy and fragile. The stillness of those oceans carries a kind of lesson. They remind us that even the largest, most vibrant systems can collapse, not just a little, but entirely. And yet, given time, they can rebuild in forms no one could predict. The silence after the great dying was not the end of the seas. It was their pause, their breath, their long, slow rehearsal for the next act. And in that rehearsal, they held on to just enough to ensure that life, in all its stubborn creativity, could one day fill the waters again. If the seas after the great dying looked strange and hostile, the skies above them were no less unsettling. Today, when we step outside, even on a quiet day, the air is full of sound and motion. Birds sweep overhead, insects buzz and flicker in the sunlight, leaves rustle, and wind pushes through the branches. But in the early Triassic, after the catastrophe had settled into silence, the skies would have been bare. Not only bare of birds, which hadn't yet evolved, but even bare of the insect swarms that had once filled the Pierian air. It's difficult for us to imagine silence that deep, because we are so accustomed to a living background hum. But that hum was almost gone. Insects had flourished for hundreds of millions of years before the great dying, becoming masters of the skies and soil alike. Their variety was astonishing, with dragonflies the size of hawks, beetles filling niches across forests, and swarms of others building complex ecosystems. And yet, this event did what no other extinction before or since has fully accomplished. It cut down the insect world. Whole groups vanished entirely, some never to return. Fossil evidence shows a dramatic drop in diversity, a thinning that left behind only a few lineages hardy enough to manage the strange new climate. For a world so often buzzing, the sudden quiet must have been profound. And without insects, many other rhythms faltered. Plants had lost their pollinators, though to be fair, most early plants were wind-pollinated anyway. Still, the lack of insects meant the skies carried no constant flicker of wings, no shimmering clouds of movement on warm days. Predators that had once relied on insect prey found themselves without meals. The cascading effect was sharp. The food web that had extended into the air broke apart, leaving behind gaps that no one filled for a very long time. Reptiles, too, had been climbing toward dominance, but many of their lines were cut short. Only a small handful of species survived, and they were not glamorous. Small, sturdy creatures that could tolerate heat and scarcity reeked out in existence. Amphibians clung to wetter regions, their calls rare in the heavy air. The large specialized predators of the Parian were gone. Gone were the Gorgonopsids, those fearsome saber-toothed reptiles that had once ruled the land. Gone were many of the amphibian giants that had lumbered through rivers and swamps. What survived was a narrower, more monotonous cast with fewer voices to fill the air. The atmosphere itself had changed too. With forests stripped back, there was less oxygen being replenished, and oxygen levels may have dipped so low that even breathing became a struggle for large animals. Imagine trying to run, to hunt, or to escape with only 2/3 the oxygen we enjoy now. Movement slowed, endurance faded. The air also held more carbon dioxide, making the climate hotter and more erratic. Skies may have appeared hazier, tinged by lingering volcanic gases. Sunlight filtered through differently, harsher in some places, dimmer in others. If you stood under that sky, it would not feel like the familiar dome we know. It would feel heavier, less welcoming. The vanishing of creatures that had filled the air left Earth oddly muted. Think about the absence of birdsong today, even for a morning or two, and how eerie it feels. Multiply that across millions of years. For a long time, the skies were little more than a space of wind and weather. Clouds drifted, storms rumbled, the sun rose and set. But the motion of animals across that space was rare. The earth felt emptied, not only at ground level, but in the very air above. And yet once again, survival found a way. Some insects did persist, clinging to niches where they could. Beetles, with their tough exoskeletons and ability to feed on decaying matter, made it through. Their role as recyclers helped stabilize soils and plant life in small ways. Dragonflies, though reduced, managed to hold on as well. These survivors were the foundation for insect recovery, though that recovery would be slow. For a long time, diversity remained thin, and ecosystems lacked the buzzing complexity they once had. On the ground, one animal in particular seemed to thrive in this sparse world. Lista, that tusked squat reptile we mentioned before, became the poster child of survival. Fossil beds across what is now Africa, Asia, and Antarctica are littered with their remains, suggesting they were everywhere. Imagine looking out across a dusty plain and seeing herds of them, trudging together in search of food, their pig-like bodies moving steadily under the hot sun. They were not beautiful in the way we might imagine prehistoric animals, but they were abundant, and abundance in that time was rare. Other survivors included small early relatives of what would one day become mammals, though at this stage they were modest, almost rodent-like in appearance, and rarely dominant. Amphibians held on to swampy refugees where water still allowed them to breathe and breed. The skies remained empty, but the ground was at least dotted with these stubborn remnants. The emptiness of the skies also meant predators could no longer swoop or stalk from above. The aerial perspective of hunting had vanished. Survival was a ground game played out in the mud, dust, and shallow waters. This shift reshaped the way ecosystems worked, forcing animals to adapt to new strategies. For millions of years, the skies remained a backdrop rather than an active part of life. Thinking about it now, it's striking to realize how much the sounds of a world shape its feeling. We rarely notice the constant noise of life until it's gone. The hum of insects, the corps of birds, a distant flutter of wings. These are the signs of a living earth. Remove them, and what's left feels uncanny, almost dreamlike. That was the reality after the Great Dying. Earth was not only quieter, but emptier in dimensions we take for granted. The air itself felt uninhabited, and yet within that emptiness there was room. Room for new experiments, for lineages that had been minor players before to step into larger roles. The ancestors of reptiles that would later saw as pterosaurs were among the hidden survivors. They were tiny then, fragile, almost invisible in the fossil record. But their persistence meant that millions of years later, the skies would be filled again, this time with new wings, new voices, new patterns of life. The stillness of those skies was not forever. But in the immediate aftermath, it must have been haunting. A planet stripped of its background chorus, left with only the wind and the weather, waiting for life to climb back into the air. That waiting stretched on for generations beyond counting. But little by little, it happened. Survivors multiplied, new forms arose, and eventually, the silence was broken again. The air we breathe today is so ordinary, we almost never think about it. Every breath fills our lungs with the same quiet mixture. Mostly nitrogen, a steady portion of oxygen, a thin slice of carbon dioxide, plus a scattering of trace gases that hardly cross our minds. It feels dependable, invisible, and safe. But in the shadow of the Great Dying, the air was anything but safe. It carried weight, heat, poison, and dust. Breathing was no longer just a passive act of living. It was a constant negotiation with an atmosphere in chaos. The eruptions in Siberia had been relentless, flooding the skies with carbon dioxide for hundreds of thousands of years. That gas, usually part of Earth's natural balance, had built up in amounts far beyond what life was used to. Imagine an invisible blanket thrown over the entire planet, trapping heat, thickening the air, and driving global temperatures upward. That blanket pressed down on every creature, turning daily life into a struggle against overheating and suffocation. Alongside carbon dioxide came sulfur gases. When those volcanoes tore open the crust, they belched sulfur dioxide into the skies. Mixed with water, it formed acid rain that fell across the land and into the seas. Forests that were already weakened by heat and drought were burned by rain that ate at leaves and soil. Rivers ran sour. Lakes turned harsh. The cycle of water, which should have refreshed the world, instead deepened its wounds. And then there was the methane. As the planet heated, frozen deposits of methane in the oceans began to release, pouring another greenhouse gas into the air. Methane is far more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat, and its sudden release would have pushed the climate into overdrive. The planet had already been warming, but with methane added to the mix, the thermostat went wild. Temperatures soared to levels Earth has rarely seen, baking the land and leaving oceans simmering. For animals trying to breathe, the problem wasn't only heat, but oxygen. During the Permian, oxygen levels had been fairly generous. But in the early Triassic, after the Great Dying, they dropped sharply, falling to around 16% of the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, at sea level today, we breathe 21% oxygen. Drop that to 16, and it feels like standing on a mountain several thousand m high. For large animals, every movement takes effort. Running is exhausting. Hunting becomes risky. Escaping predators drains energy faster than it can be regained. Life slows down, not out of choice, but out of necessity. And the atmosphere carried something else, too. Something that touched every corner of daily existence. Particulates, ash and dust from eruptions, circled the planet, sometimes blocking sunlight, sometimes letting it blaze through unfiltered. In the immediate aftermath of eruptions, skies might have dimmed, cooling the surface for years at a time. But once the haze settled, greenhouse gases dominated and heat surged back with greater force. The climate flipped between extremes, a seesaw of cooling and heating, both destructive in their own way. What would it have felt like to live under such a sky? Imagine stepping outside and finding the air hotter than it should be, carrying a sharp edge of sulfur that stings your nose and throat. Clouds pass overhead, but drop rain that burns rather than refreshes. The horizon shimmers not with the clean blue we know, but with a dusty, hazy glare. Sunlight feels closer, harsher, because the protective ozone above has thinned. Ultraviolet radiation pours down, burning leaves, stressing animals, and sterilizing soils. Shade offers little relief when the air itself is part of the problem. For plants, the atmosphere was both a burden and a filter. Acid rain damaged leaves and stripped nutrients from the soil. High carbon dioxide levels, which in theory might promote plant growth, were countered by heat and drought at withered seedlings before they could take root. Forests that had once stretched for miles were reduced to patches of ferns and shrubs. The air carried more carbon, but gave back less oxygen, a lopsided balance that made every breath harder for the animals that remained. For the seas, the atmosphere was a direct pipeline of harm. Carbon dioxide, dissolving into water, drove acidification that destroyed shells and skeletons. Methane pushed heat further, warming currents beyond their natural limits. And low oxygen in the air mirrored low oxygen in the water, creating vast dead zones where little could survive. The atmosphere and the oceans were not separate worlds. They were locked in a feedback loop, each worsening the other, each stripping away more of what life needed. Fossil evidence gives us hints of how extreme this was. Layers of rock from this period show chemical signatures of wildly fluctuating climates. Some layers suggest short bursts of cooling where ash blocked the sun. Others reveal long stretches of searing heat where greenhouse gases dominated. The overall pattern is chaos, not stability. For life, that meant unpredictability. Creatures couldn't adapt to one steady state. They had to endure constant swings. One generation might grow up in slightly cooler, hazier skies, only for their offspring to face blistering heat under a thinner ozone layer. There was no rhythm, no reliability. And yet, even in this hostile air, survival persisted. Small burrowing animals escaped the worst heat by sheltering underground. Some amphibians retreated to shaded swamps where water buffered the temperature swings. Microbes thrived in places where oxygen was scarce, turning the very chemistry of the air and soil into energy. Plants, though weakened, managed to cling to life in scattered patches, spreading spores that drifted on wind still strong enough to carry them across empty landscapes. Every breath might have been a challenge, but every successful breath carried life one step further. One of the strangest aspects of this chaotic atmosphere is how long it lingered. Recovery wasn't quick. The planet systems had been thrown so far out of balance that millions of years passed before the air resembled anything stable again. During that time, oxygen crept back slowly. Carbon dioxide levels declined inch by inch, and the ozone layer patched itself only gradually. Generation after generation of creatures lived and died in conditions we would find unlivable, slowly adjusting, slowly adapting, until the balance began to return. It's tempting to imagine that after the great dying ended, the earth immediately began healing like a wound closing once the injury has stopped. But the atmosphere tells a different story. The wound didn't close quickly. It festered. It lingered. It shifted back and forth between fever and chill. Only with time, enormous stretches of it, did the fever break. When you think about it like that, the atmosphere becomes a character in the story, not just a backdrop. It wasn't a passive sky. It was an active force shaping what lived, what died, and what directions evolution could take. It determined where plants could grow, how animals could move, and what kinds of bodies could endure. It was a filter, a gatekeeper, harsh, but not entirely unyielding. Through it, the survivors of the great dying past changed and emerged, ready to see the next phase of life. And if you pause to think about your own breathing right now, the quiet in and out that you hardly notice, it's strange to remember how fragile that rhythm can be. Today, we take in air rich with oxygen, cooled by a balanced climate, filtered by forests and oceans working together. But for millions of years after the great dying, every breath was a harder negotiation. And yet somehow enough of those negotiations succeeded to keep the story of life going. If the air after the great dying carried weight and poison, the land below it looked hollow. Forests that had stretched for miles were gone. What had once been green and shaded and filled with sound was replaced by a quieter, paler world. The earth had lost its canopy, and without that canopy, everything felt exposed. For most of the late Permian, forests had been thick and diverse. Towering conifers reached into the sky. Seed ferns spread across the landscape. Beneath them, ground plants created carpets of green. These forests weren't just scenery. They were engines of life. Their roots stabilized soil. Their leaves fed animals and insects. Their canopies shaded streams. And their fallen wood built habitats for countless others. They were the lungs and scaffolding of ecosystems. When they collapsed, the structure of life collapsed with them. Cole tells the story clearly. For hundreds of millions of years, forests had been building coal seams, layer after layer of compressed plant matter. But in the rock record, there's a sharp gap that follows the great dying. For millions of years, coal simply doesn't appear. No new forests were growing dense enough or stable enough to leave behind thick deposits. That absence is called the coal gap, and it's one of the clearest fingerprints of just how devastating the loss of plant life was. The earth itself stopped recording forests in stone. On the ground, the absence of forest reshaped everything. Without roots to hold soil, erosion ran rampant. Rain stripped hillsides bare, carrying mud and sand into rivers. Floods became more destructive, carving away land that would once have been protected by vegetation. Rivers swelled with silt, and deltas choked on mud. The cycle of land and water, which had been stabilized by trees, broke down. The land itself seemed to unravel. For the animals that remained, this meant less shelter and less food. Forests had been hiding places, hunting grounds, and pantries all at once. Without them, creatures were forced into open spaces exposed to heat and predators alike. Shade was rare, making the already harsh climate even harder to endure. Amphibians struggled without damp forest floors. Reptiles trudged across open ground with little cover. The rhythm of life that had once moved through shaded groves now shuffled awkwardly across barren plains. The silence of these landscapes must have been profound. Today, even in small patches of forest, you can hear the constant layering of sound, leaves stirring, insects buzzing, birds calling, branches creaking. Strip that away, and the quiet becomes heavy. Wind still moved. Storms still rolled in, but the living soundtrack had thinned to almost nothing. Imagine walking across what should have been a forest, and hearing only the crunch of your own footsteps. Yet, even in that emptiness, survivors clung on. Ferns were among the first to return. They spread quickly across disturbed ground, covering barren soil with green mats. They didn't form towering forests, but they were enough to hold the earth together in small patches. Other hardy plants managed to persist too. Shrubs, low conifers, scattered seed ferns. They were scrappy, not majestic, but they filled gaps where they could. The pattern of plant life after the great dying was patchy and uneven. Instead of continuous forests, the land was dotted with fragments, pockets of green, surrounded by vast stretches of bare ground. Animals would have moved from patch to patch, searching for food and shelter. It was a fragmented existence, fragile and temporary, but it was still life. Fossil spores tell us much about this recovery. In the rock record, Spores appear in abundance after the extinction, especially from ferns. That makes sense. Ferns reproduce quickly and spread widely, sending their spores drifting on the wind. They're opportunists able to colonize empty ground faster than trees. Their sudden dominance was like a green bandage over the raw earth. For a while, much of the world may have been covered not by forests, but by vast fields of ferns, low and uniform, stretching where trees had once stood tall. The loss of forests also meant a collapse of complexity. Forests create layers, canopy, understory, ground cover, each with its own niches for animals and insects. Without that structure, the diversity of habitats shrank. Life became simpler, flatter, less varied. Food chains shortened. Ecosystems that had been intricate webs became thin strands. The land felt emptier, not just in sight, but in function. And still slowly, resilience showed itself. In time, conifers began to return, spreading into areas where ferns had stabilized the soil. Shrubs grew taller and seed plants reappeared. These weren't the same forest that had existed before. They were new assemblages built from survivors, newcomers. They lacked the scale of the old growth, but they laid the groundwork for recovery. The earth was relearning how to be green. What's remarkable is how long this took. The coal gap lasted about 10 million years. That means entire lineages of animals lived and died in a world without true forests. Generations upon generations never knew the deep shade of towering trees. For them, the open, scrubby landscape was normal. The memory of forests belonged only to fossils, not to the living. Think for a moment about the role forests play today. They regulate climate, cycle water, anchor soil, and provide homes for countless species, including us. Losing them, even briefly, changes everything. After the Great Dying, that loss wasn't brief. It was an age. The Earth spent millions of years breathing shallowly without its forests, running on the faint pulse of ferns and shrubs instead of the steady heartbeat of trees. And yet, when forests finally did return, they carried with them new possibilities. The plants that rebuilt the world were different, setting the stage for the ecosystems of the Triassic and beyond. Forests would never again look exactly as they had in the Permian, but in their new forms, they created opportunities for reptiles, insects, and eventually dinosaurs to flourish. The silence of the green world did not last forever. It was a pause, a gap, a silence between movements in the symphony of life. For those who lived in that silence, though, it was the whole world. Open land, patchy greenery, heavy air, and a quiet that must have felt endless. Day after day, year after year, the earth's green silence stretched on. And yet, beneath that silence, the first notes of recovery were already beginning. After the forest had collapsed and the oceans had turned sluggish, the world did not bounce back with speed. It lingered. It hesitated. Life took its time to recover, not because it was lazy, but because the damage had been so deep that healing could not be rushed. If the Great Dying was a wound, the scar tissue formed slowly, stretching across millions of years. To call it a pause is almost misleading, because life was still moving, still breathing, still struggling forward. But compared to the pace of earlier recoveries, this one was astonishingly slow. Extinction events often act like pruning shears. They cut back life, but what's left regrows quickly, filling empty spaces with new experiments. After the asteroid strike that ended the age of dinosaurs, mammals surged within a few hundred years, diversifying into shapes that would soon dominate the Earth. But after the Great Dying, the pruning was too severe. There were hardly any branches left to regrow. Diversity had been cut down to a thin stump, and the stump needed time just to push out new shoots. Scientists sometimes call this period an evolutionary bottleneck. Imagine a crowded highway suddenly narrowed to a single lane. Traffic doesn't stop entirely, but it slows to a crawl. Only a few cars get through, and the variety of vehicles is reduced to whatever can fit in that lane. That's what life was like in the early Triassic. A few lineages managed to slip through, but the diversity of forms had been crushed. It took millions of years before new lanes opened, before traffic began to flow again. For animals, the pores meant monotonous landscapes, filled with the same creatures again and again. Fossil beds from this time often show overwhelming dominance by one or two species. Listoris, that tusked pig-like reptile, was everywhere. In some places, 9 out of every 10 fossils are Listoris. It's hard to picture such uniformity. Imagine walking across a continent and seeing the same creature on every plain and every valley, trudging across every hillside. That sameness is a sign of how little variety there was. Ecosystems weren't balanced. They were lopsided, dominated by whoever was tough enough to endure. The oceans showed the same sluggishness. Instead of diverse reefs, they were carpeted with microbial mats. Instead of bustling schools of fish, they were thinly populated with survivors. For millions of years, those mats covered the seafloor, a slimy reminder of how far life had regressed. Recovery in the water was just as hesitant as on land. And for a long time, the seas looked more like they had in Earth's distant past than in its recent one. What made this pause so long? Part of it was the scale of the catastrophe. With up to 90% of marine species and 70% of land species gone, there simply weren't enough survivors to rebuild quickly. Evolution needs diversity to work with, and the Great Dying had wiped that slate almost clean. Another factor was the instability of the environment. The climate swung between extremes with heat, drought, and floods disrupting any progress. Oxygen levels remained low, making life harder for large animals. Forests were gone, leaving landscapes vulnerable to erosion and deserts spreading across once fertile ground. In short, conditions didn't just kill life once. They kept life struggling for millions of years afterward. Think of it like trying to rebuild a house after a fire. But the ground keeps shaking. The rain keeps falling acid, and the air is thick with smoke. You can put up walls, but they collapse again. You can lay a foundation, but it erodes beneath your feet. The survivors of the Great Dying are trying to build in a world that wouldn't stay still. A pause wasn't just about time. It was about repeated setbacks. And yet, slowly, inch by inch, life did begin to return. Ferns spread across the land first, stabilizing soil. Small shrubs followed, and eventually conifers began to grow again. These plants created new habitats, however fragile, and gave animals places to live. Insects, though diminished, started to diversify again, buzzing back into ecosystems that had been too quiet. In the seas, sponges and bivalves laid the groundwork for new reef systems. Fish began to appear in greater numbers, and predators slowly re-emerged. The long pause was not complete stillness. It was the faint stirring of recovery, stretched across spans of time almost too vast to comprehend. Imagine living through it if you could. From the perspective of a single animal, the world probably felt normal. A Listoris grazing on ferns wouldn't know that its species dominated an unusually empty landscape. It would simply live, eat, reproduce, and die, never aware of the larger picture. The pause wasn't obvious to those living it. It was only obvious in hindsight when we look back across millions of years and see how long it took for diversity to return. To the creatures themselves, life went on as best it could. Fossils from this period often show signs of stress. Growth rings in bones are irregular, suggesting animals struggled with changing conditions. Plants left patchy records with bursts of spores indicating sudden expansions, followed by setbacks. It's as if the earth kept trying to restart only to stall again and again. But eventually, persistence won out. The pause, long as it was, did not last forever. What's striking is how this slow recovery shaped the future. Because life had been narrowed through such a tight bottleneck, the lineages that survived had outsized influence on what came next. Reptiles, for example, managed to pull through, and in the absence of competition, they spread into new roles. From those modest survivors came the ancestors of dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodiles. Early relatives of mammals survived, too. Small and unremarkable at first, but laying the groundwork for the mammals that would one day follow. The long pause was frustratingly slow, but it created the conditions for entirely new worlds of life. The coal gap, the insect collapse, the microbial seas. All of these signs remind us how deep the pause really was. It wasn't just a quiet moment. It was a reset that stretched across an entire era. 5 million years passed before reefs reappeared. 10 million years before forests returned to something resembling their former strength. For comparison, all of human history from the first cities to today fits into just a sliver of that time. The pause after the Great Dying was not just long. It was almost unimaginable. And yet the pause is part of the story. Without it, the recovery might have looked very different. Without that bottleneck, dinosaurs might never have risen. Mammals might not have had their chance. The world that emerged after the pause was new, distinct from the Parian that came before. It was not a simple restoration. It was a reinvention. From our vantage point, the long pause is easy to see as empty space on a timeline, a lull between one age and another. But if you listen closely, it's full of quiet persistence. The shuffle of Listsaurus herds, the spread of ferns across barren ground, the slow, patient work of microbes in the seas. None of it looked dramatic at the time, but together it carried life through the hardest trial it had ever faced. The pause was not silence. It was survival stretched thin, waiting for its chance to expand again. When we talk about survival after something as immense as the Great Dying, it's easy to picture the bigger animals, the tusked reptiles trudging across open plains, or the amphibians clinging to shrinking pools. But in truth, much of the story belongs to the tiny survivors, the creatures most of us would overlook if we could somehow walk through that world. They were small in body, but their role in keeping life alive was enormous. Sometimes the quietest lives are the ones that hold everything together. Consider the insects. They'd taken a massive blow, far worse than in any other extinction event. Whole groups disappeared, some never to return. But not all were lost. Beetles, in particular, managed to pull through. Their toughness lies partly in their design. With hardened outer wings acting as armor, they can protect themselves against harsh conditions. And they're not picky eaters. Many beetles are scavengers, chewing through decaying matter that other creatures ignore. In a world stripped of abundance, that adaptability gave them an edge. Beetles became recyclers in a land where waste piled up, breaking down dead plants and animals and returning nutrients to the soil. They may not have been glamorous, but they were essential. Other insects clung on as well, though in reduced numbers. Dragonflies managed to survive, though the giant species of earlier ages dwindled away. Their smaller cousins found ways to keep flying, feeding on what little prey remained. Their presence kept some measure of balance in ecosystems that were otherwise bare. Even in low numbers, they were predators that helped prevent smaller populations from swelling out of control. Flies, too, began to find footholds, buzzing into niches left empty by others. And beneath the soil, even smaller survivors carried on their invisible work. Microbes, bacteria, and fungi were not just present. They thrived. The harsh conditions that drove many animals to extinction were opportunities for microbes. In the oxygen-starved seas, bacteria that could handle sulfur and methane spread widely, forming colorful mats across seafloors and shorelines. On land, fungi broke down whatever organic matter remained, cycling nutrients that plants would need if they were ever to return in force. We tend not to give microbes much credit in stories like this, but in truth, they were the backbone of survival. When forests collapsed and animals died in vast numbers, microbes took on the role of recycling the remains. They broke down what was left and built the foundation for soil and water systems to recover. Without them, nutrients would have stayed locked away in dead matter, unusable for new growth. Microbes are the unseen custodians of ecosystems, and after the Great Dying, they were busier than ever. Some of the most critical survivors were cyanobacteria, those tiny organisms capable of photosynthesis. In oceans stripped of complexity, they floated near the surface, capturing sunlight and producing oxygen. Even when larger plants and algae faltered, cyanobacteria continued their slow work, drip-feeding oxygen back into the atmosphere and keeping the planet from slipping into suffocating stillness. They had done it before, billions of years earlier, during the Great Oxidation Event, and they kept doing it now. In many ways, these microscopic survivors were the reason oxygen ever climbed back to levels that larger animals could handle. On land, small burrowing animals found safety underground. The harsh climate above with its heat and dryness was brutal. But underground, temperatures were more stable and moisture lingered longer. Creatures that could dig, like early relatives of mammals and reptiles, had a distinct advantage. Even small amphibians could find refuge in burrows, avoiding the worst of the drought and heat. Life shrank itself to fit into the cracks, holding on until conditions improved. It's worth picturing this not as a world of big dramatic survivors, but as a patchwork of tiny, stubborn lives. Picture a beetle chewing through dead wood in the shadow of a collapsed forest. Picture a dragonfly skimming across a murky pond that had once been part of a thriving ecosystem. Picture mats of bacteria turning black sediments into a living surface. Strange and slimy, but functional. None of it looks like the grandeur of pre-extinction life, but all of it mattered. Sometimes survival isn't about strength or size, but about flexibility. The tiny survivors after the Great Dying weren't specialized masters of one environment. They were generalists, able to shift diets, tolerate stress, or hide in places others couldn't. That's a pattern we see again and again in mass extinctions. Specialists vanish while generalists pull through. The beetles, the microbes, the borrowers, they were the generalists of their age. For millions of years, the fossil record shows little bursts of these small lives scattered across barren landscapes and stagnant seas. It's not an impressive record if you're looking for diversity, but it's a remarkable one if you think about persistence against odds that wiped away 90% of their neighbors. These creatures endured. They didn't thrive in the sense of abundance, but they held on long enough for new opportunities to open. And eventually, those tiny survivors became the ancestors of much larger stories. The insects that clung on would diversify again, eventually filling skies with buzzing and fluttering life. The small reptile-like burers would evolve into lineages that gave rise to mammals. The microbes that kept cycling nutrients would ensure that plants could return, building the green scaffolding of ecosystems once more. What looks small in the moment can prove monumental in the long run. The image of the post-extinction Earth then isn't just one of emptiness. It's one of resilience written small. Every patch of moss-like growth, every scuttling beetle, every bacterial film was a sign that life, while diminished, was still working. It was patchy, fragile, and often invisible, but it was enough to keep the story going. And sometimes enough is all that matters. When you imagine that world, think less about what was gone and more about what managed to stay. Because in those survivors lay the blueprint for everything that would follow. The giants were gone. The forests had fallen. The oceans were quiet. But the tiny survivors, the overlooked and the humble, were still there. And in their persistence, they carried the weight of Earth's future. When most people imagine the history of life, they picture the big things. Dinosaurs roaming through forests, mammoths crossing icy plains, giant fish cruising prehistoric seas. But after the Great Dying, the stage belonged not to giants, but to the smallest forms of life. For a long stretch of time, the Earth was essentially microbial. Bacteria ruled not in the sense of parades or armies, but in the quiet way that persistence itself can dominate. The collapse of forests and reefs had cleared away the complex structures of ecosystems. That left behind a stripped-down planet where the rules of survival were brutally simple. And in simplicity, microbes thrived. They didn't need stable climates or elaborate food webs. They could make a living in conditions that killed almost everything else. Where oxygen was scarce, microbes that fed on sulfur or methane filled the gap. Where the oceans turned stagnant, mats of bacteria spread across the seafloor, building slimy carpets that replaced corals. Where soils eroded into mud, bacteria moved in, breaking down whatever organic scraps remained. In many ways, this wasn't entirely new for them. Microbes had been the rulers of Earth for billions of years before animals or plants appeared. They had built the first ecosystems, fueled the first oxygen in the air, and shaped the planet's chemistry in ways we're still uncovering. So, when the Great Dying leveled the field, microbes simply returned to a role they had played before. For them, this wasn't a setback. It was a second reign. Picture the oceans at that time. Instead of reefs built by corals and teeming with fish, the seabed was often covered in thick microbial mats. These mats trapped sediments, formed strange layered structures, and spread across wide areas. If you stepped into shallow water, your feet would sink into them like stepping onto a slimy rug. In the fossil record, we see their signature in the form of stromatolites, layered rocks created by the activity of microbial communities. Stromatolites had been common billions of years earlier, then declined as more complex animals spread. After the Great Dying, they reappeared in abundance. Evidence that the seas had reverted to something much more primitive. The colors of the water would have been different too with bacterial blooms dominating. The surface might have shimmered green, while deeper layers glowed purple or red from sulfur-loving microbes. The chemistry of the water shifted constantly, sometimes rich in hydrogen sulfide, sometimes poor in oxygen. For larger animals, these swings were deadly. For microbes, they were opportunities. The seas belonged to them. Layer upon layer of microscopic kingdoms, invisible to the eye, but overwhelming in presence. On land, bacteria and fungi carried out the slow work of recycling. With forests gone, dead wood and plant matter piled up. Microbes broke it down, returning nutrients to the soil. Without them, the land would have stayed barren much longer. They also colonized bare rocks, creating the first films of life that would allow plants to grow again. In that way, they prepared the ground for recovery, acting as the invisible pioneers of ecosystems that hadn't yet returned. What's remarkable is how diverse microbes can be in their survival strategies. Some fed on light, capturing energy directly from the sun. Others fed on chemicals, thriving in places that to us would seem poisonous. Sulfur bacteria, for example, flourished in stagnant waters where hydrogen sulfide collected. Methanogens, microbes that produce methane, found niches in oxygen-poor sediments. Every chemical imbalance created by the catastrophe was a niche waiting for microbes to fill. They weren't just survivors. They were opportunists that turned disaster into dominance. For larger creatures that did survive, microbes were both allies and hazards. On one hand, microbial blooms provided food for some small animals. Plankton-eating fish and invertebrates could scrape by on them. On the other hand, toxic blooms could suffocate or poison waters, creating dead zones where nothing else could live. Entire stretches of ocean alternated between being slimy soup and barren wastelands, depending on which microbes were in charge. The microbial world was both foundation and obstacle. It's important to remember that microbial Earth didn't mean lifeless Earth. Quite the opposite. Life was everywhere, just not in forms we would notice at a glance. Billions upon billions of bacteria covered surfaces swam in droplets and layered in sediments. The Earth was still alive, but its aliveness had shrunk to the smallest scale. To an outside observer, it might have looked quiet. But beneath that quiet was furious activity, cells dividing, chemical reactions buzzing, invisible kingdoms carrying on without pause. From a long view, this microbial reign was more than a stopgap. It was a stabilizer. While animals and plants struggled to recover, microbes kept Earth's systems turning. They recycled carbon, cycled sulfur, generated oxygen, and built the groundwork for higher life to return. It's easy to think of them as simple, but in truth, they were running the planet. The pause in visible complexity was a surge in microscopic dominance. The fossil record gives us small but telling clues of this dominance. Stromatolites, once nearly extinct, became common again. Black shells rich in organic matter tell us that microbial blooms were widespread in stagnant seas. Chemical signatures in rocks show cycles of sulfur and methane controlled by microbial activity. It's as if the fingerprints of bacteria are written across the stone, recording a time when they were the engineers of Earth's systems. And eventually, as conditions stabilized, their influence paved the way for others. The oxygen produced by photosynthetic microbes slowly crept upward, allowing large animals to return. The soils enriched by decomposers gave plants a foothold. The layered mats in the oceans created habitats where new communities could form. When forests and reefs finally reappeared, it was only because microbes had held the planet together long enough for that recovery to be possible. When you picture that time, don't imagine emptiness. Imagine a world buzzing at a scale too small for us to see. Imagine every drop of water, every patch of soil, every grain of sediment alive with countless cells, each carrying out the basic work of survival. Imagine seas glowing purple with bacterial blooms, shorelines slippery with mats, rocks coated in thin films of green. It wasn't a world we would find beautiful, but it was a world that endured. And endurance is what mattered. The great dying had nearly erased complexity, but it couldn't erase persistence. Microbes had been here before, in times when Earth was far harsher than even this. They had survived ice ages that froze the planet and heat waves that scorched it. To them, the great dying was just another test. And like every test before, they passed. Their reign would not last forever. Eventually, animals and plants would reclaim dominance. Forests would rise again, reefs would return, and dinosaurs would walk across green landscapes under skies filled with new kinds of life. But none of that could have happened without the microbial age in between, the long stretch of time when bacteria ruled the world. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. It was the quiet bridge between collapse and recovery, carried on the backs of cells too small to see, but too important to ignore. After the long silence of microbial seas, the oceans began to change again. Slowly, cautiously, life started to push beyond mats of bacteria and into forms we would recognize as animals. The process was not quick. For millions of years after the Great Dying, the oceans were fragile, unstable, and still prone to collapse. But inch by inch, the waters that had been stripped bare began to host new players. Out of emptiness came the beginnings of rebirth. At first, the comeback was uneven. In some places, microbial mats still ruled, slimy layers covering rocks and shallows. But here and there, small animals began to creep back. Bivalves, the ancestors of clams and mussels, found ways to survive in these difficult seas. Their ability to live in muddy, low-oxygen conditions gave them an advantage. They settled into sediments, filtering whatever food particles drifted by. They weren't glamorous, but they were sturdy. And in the long run, sturdiness mattered more than spectacle. Sponges also returned, quietly reclaiming their role as filter feeders. They attached themselves to rocks and shallow seafloors, pumping water through their bodies to capture food. In time, some of them began to form primitive reef-like structures, small and scattered compared to the vast coral reefs that had collapsed, but still significant. These sponge reefs were modest beginnings, but they signaled that complexity was stirring again. Other survivors included ammonoids, relatives of the ammonites that would later flourish. These spiral-shelled creatures had been nearly wiped out in the extinction, but a few lineages held on. They were smaller than their Parian ancestors, but they drifted back into the seas, using their shells to control buoyancy and move through the water. Over millions of years, they diversified again, filling roles as predators and prey. Their persistence is a reminder of how survival at small scales can blossom into dominance later. Fish, too, found their way back. Early bony fish began to spread, though in reduced numbers at first. Sharks and their relatives persisted, though they had lost much of their diversity. In the murky, unstable seas, these predators swam cautiously, surviving in low abundance, but maintaining a foothold. For a long time, the oceans lacked the abundance of predators that had once kept ecosystems in check. Food chains were shorter, simpler, but slowly they began to lengthen again as fish populations expanded. The fossil record shows us that recovery in the oceans was not smooth. There were setbacks with waves of warming and oxygen loss causing repeated crashes. At times, diversity began to rise only to collapse again. The seas after the Great Dying were fragile, easily tipped back into chaos. But each time, enough survivors clung on to keep the process moving forward. Over millions of years, those repeated struggles built resilience, shaping lineages that could handle swings in climate and chemistry. One of the strangest aspects of this recovery was the role of sponges and bivalves in building new ecosystems. In the absence of corals, they became the scaffolding of marine life. Imagine a shallow seafloor dotted with sponge reefs and bivalve beds. Not as colorful or dramatic as coral reefs, but alive with activity nonetheless. Small fish darted among them. Invertebrates grazed and hid in their structures. Microbial mats filled in the gaps, creating a patchwork of old and new. It wasn't the same ocean as before. It was a different one built on the survivors who could tolerate its instability. Over time, diversity returned, though it took millions of years to approach anything like pre-extinction levels. Ammonoids grew more abundant, fish diversified, and new predators began to emerge. By the middle of the Triassic, ichthyosaurs, the great marine reptiles, appeared sleek and powerful, shaped like dolphins, but descended from land reptiles. They would become some of the dominant predators of the seas, a sign that marine ecosystems had not only recovered, but evolved into new forms. But their rise was only possible because the simpler foundations had been rebuilt first. If you could have stood by the shore in those early days of recovery, the view would still have been strange. The water might look calm, but beneath it, the communities were patchy. Some areas still covered in slime, others dotted with bivalves and sponges, others showing hints of growing diversity. The sound of waves would be the same, but the life beneath them was still tentative, still fragile, still feeling out its place in a world that had nearly ended. And yet there's something remarkable about that fragility. It shows us that recovery isn't a straight line, but a process of trial and error. The oceans after the Great Dying were experiments running in every direction. Some failed, collapsing quickly. Others succeeded, laying the groundwork for ecosystems that would last millions of years. The seas had been stripped of complexity, but that stripping opened space for new lineages to try new strategies. From those experiments came the future of marine life as we know it. The phrase oceans reborn might sound dramatic, but in reality, it was slow, quiet, and often invisible on a human scale. Rebirth came not as a sudden flourish, but as a gradual accumulation. A bivalve here, a sponge there, an ammonoid drifting by, a fish making dew in shallow water. Piece by piece, they rebuilt the puzzle, and eventually the puzzle became recognizable again. Not identical to what had been lost, but alive in its own right. When we look at reefs today with their dazzling fish and colorful corals, it's easy to forget how many times life has had to start over. The Great Dying nearly erased reefs entirely, and for millions of years, they were gone. Their return was not inevitable. It depended on the persistence of tiny survivors and the slow rebirth of seas that had been poisoned and stripped bare. That they did return at all is a testament to the stubbornness of life. The oceans reborn after the great dying weren't the same oceans as before. They were new, shaped by survivors, and defined by resilience. And in their strangeness, they held the seeds of the future. Marine reptiles, new fish, new reefs, new balances. What began as silence and slime became in time a symphony of life again. It just needed patience measured not in years or centuries, but in millions of years. While the oceans were finding their way back from silence, the land was also stirring. It didn't happen quickly, and it didn't happen evenly, but step by step, patch by patch, life began to reclaim ground that had been stripped bare. To imagine those first steps of recovery is to picture a world that still looked broken, but was quietly, stubbornly beginning to heal. The land after the great dying had been left hollow. Forests had collapsed, soils had eroded. Animals had thinned to a fraction of their former diversity. For a long stretch, the plains were dominated by little more than ferns and scattered shrubs. It wasn't a landscape of towering trees, but one of low, patchy greenery. Across this sparse cover, animals that had managed to survive trudged on. It wasn't lush. It wasn't vibrant, but it was alive, and that made all the difference. One of the most striking signs of this recovery is the overwhelming presence of a single creature. Listerous fossils of this tusked, stocky animal are so common in early Triassic rocks that it sometimes feels like the whole world belonged to them. In some places, 9 out of every 10 skeletons found belonged to Lystrosaurus. They were small compared to the predators of the Parian, with squat bodies and a pig-like build. But they were hardy. They could dig. They could eat tough plants. And they could tolerate harsh climates. In a world where specialization spelled doom, Lystrosaurus survived by being adaptable. It's easy to picture them moving across barren plains, herds of them browsing on ferns, leaving trails of trampled greenery behind. They may not have been elegant, but they filled the empty spaces left by extinction. They were everywhere, and in their abundance, they stabilized ecosystems that had been reduced to fragments. Without them, the land might have stayed emptier for longer. Other creatures found their way back too. Amphibians, though diminished, clung to rivers and swamps. Some of them grew to impressive sizes, lurking in shallow waters like living holdovers from an earlier time. They weren't as diverse as before, but they played their part, feeding on insects and small reptiles, adding movement to ecosystems that were still thin. Their calls, echoing across wetlands, must have been among the few sounds breaking the silence of those landscapes. Small reptiles also began to diversify again. They were not the dominant dinosaurs of later ages, not yet. Instead, they were modest creatures, scurrying across the ground, feeding on insects or plants, testing out niches left open by extinction. These early steps mattered. From them, over millions of years would come the great lineages of the Triassic, Aurosaurs, the ancestors of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. But in the beginning, they were simply survivors trying to find a foothold. Insects, too, began to buzz back into the picture. Their diversity had been crushed, but beetles and dragonflies held on, and new groups began to emerge. Their return added emotion and sound to the land, pollinating plants, recycling waste, and feeding other animals. Slowly, the skies were no longer entirely empty. The faint hum of insects began to weave itself back into the soundtrack of Earth. Plants pushed the recovery forward as well. Ferns spread across open ground, stabilizing soils. Small conifers began to grow again, reaching upward where once only low greenery had stood. Seed plants returned, adding complexity to the patchwork. These plants were not forests, not yet, but they were steps toward forests. They broke the monotony of barren plains and created pockets of shade and shelter. The fossil record shows us how tentative these steps were. Plant spores spike in abundance after the extinction. Evidence of fern spreading rapidly across disturbed ground. Conifer pollen begins to appear again, though in low numbers at first. Bones of animals cluster in certain layers, suggesting populations were thin and patchy. It wasn't a smooth expansion, but a stuttering one, full of setbacks and small gains. The climate didn't make it easy. The air was still hot. Carbon dioxide was still high and oxygen levels were still low. Rain fell irregularly, sometimes in destructive floods, sometimes in long droughts. Animals and plants trying to spread often face sudden reversals. But over time, resilience built itself back into the system. The more plants spread, the more they stabilized soils. The more insects returned, the more they supported plants. The more animals survived, the more complex the food webs became. Step by step, the land found its rhythm again. It's striking to realize how different these early ecosystems were from what came before. The Permian had been full of towering forests and powerful predators. The early Triassic was simpler, quieter, more uniform. Instead of intricate webs, there were short chains. Instead of dense forests, there were scattered patches. But in that simplicity lay the seeds of something new. The world wasn't rebuilding the past. It was building a future, one that would eventually lead to the age of dinosaurs. If you could stand on the land, then you might not be impressed. You would see herds of the same stocky animals, fields of ferns, a few small reptiles darting between shrubs, amphibians lurking in muddy pools. It would look repetitive, almost monotonous, compared to the lush variety of the Permian. But beneath that simplicity, the machinery of recovery was churning. Genes were mutating. Populations were adapting. Lineages were branching. Given enough time, those unremarkable scenes would give rise to some of the most remarkable ecosystems Earth has ever known. The first steps on land were not dramatic. They were small, slow, and often unnoticed. But they were crucial. Without those early survivors, without Lista trudging across plains, without beetles recycling waste, without ferns spreading across bare soil, the land might never have recovered. The first steps don't always look grand, but they are what make the next steps possible. And so after the silence of extinction, the land began to stir again, not with grandeur, not with sudden abundance, but with persistence. The first steps of recovery were enough to break the stillness, and from there, the journey could continue. When you picture the land after the great dying, it's not filled with graceful giants or lush forests. Instead, it's a world of oddities, a cast of strange survivors that don't always fit our ideas of what prehistoric life should look like. Chief among them is Listaurus, a creature so unassuming that if you saw it today, you might not even glance twice. And yet, in the early Triassic, this squat-tusked reptile became one of the most successful animals Earth has ever known. Lista didn't look like a ruler of worlds. It was about the size of a pig or a small cow with a barrel-shaped body, stumpy legs, and a head capped by a blunt snout. 2 tusks jutted forward from its mouth, and behind them was a beak-like structure that it used to crop tough plants. Its body plan was simple, almost comical compared to the saber-toothed predators and towering amphibians of the Permian. And yet, when those others fell, Listaurus thrived. Fossil evidence tells us just how extraordinary their success was. In some areas, up to 90% of all land vertebrate fossils belong to Listaurus. Imagine traveling across continents and finding the same animal everywhere. Plains in what is now South Africa, valleys in Russia, rivers in China, all filled with herds of this same stocky creature. In terms of dominance, few animals in history have matched it. For a time, the Earth seemed to belong to Lystrosaurus. Why did they succeed where so many others failed? Part of the answer lies in their adaptability. Lystrosaurus was a generalist, able to eat a wide range of plants. In a world where food was scarce and patchy, that flexibility mattered. They were also borrowers. Fossil burrows attributed to Lystrosaurus suggest they dug into the ground, sheltering from the heat and dryness of the early Triassic climate. Burrows would have protected them from sudden swings in temperature, from predators, and even from drought. They didn't need lush forests or stable weather. They made do with whatever was at hand. Their physiology may have helped, too. Bone studies suggest that the Listoris grew quickly, reaching adulthood in just a few years. That rapid growth meant they could reproduce faster and bounce back from population losses more effectively. In a world where conditions were unpredictable, speed was survival. Even if many died young, enough would reach maturity to keep herds thriving. And then there were the tusks. While their exact purpose is still debated, they may have helped Listoris dig through tough ground or strip bark and roots. In a landscape stripped of leafy abundance, being able to access buried or woody plant material gave them another edge. They weren't picky eaters, and that lack of pickiness was a key to their success. But Listoris was not alone. Other strange survivors filled the early Triassic alongside it, though none reached the same overwhelming dominance. Small amphibians clung to wetlands, some of them descendants of Parian giants reduced to more modest forms. Early archosaurs, small, lightly built reptiles, scurried across open ground. Barely noticeable at first, but destined for greatness in the future. Cynodonts, early relatives of mammals, also made it through. They were small, fur-covered, and unremarkable at the time, but they carried traits that would one day define an entire class of animals. The oddity of this caste lies in how unlike each other they were. There was no single formula for survival. Some were borrowers, some were scavengers, some relied on rapid reproduction. Some shrank in size to cope with limited food. Others endured by sheer toughness. What they shared was not appearance, but strategy, flexibility, persistence, and the ability to live in marginal conditions. If you walked across that world, you would see herds of Listoris dominating plains, small reptiles darting in the undergrowth, amphibians lurking in pools, and the occasional early cynodon nosing through vegetation. It wouldn't look diverse by our standards, but compared to the silence that came right after the extinction, it was a step forward. The land was no longer empty. It was populated by survivors, each odd in its own way, but together keeping life going. Fossil evidence even hints that some of these survivors bred far beyond what we might expect. Lista fossils have been found across much of the southern hemisphere, suggesting they ranged widely. That kind of distribution is rare, especially in such a disrupted time. It shows how effectively they colonized new environments. Where other species faltered, Listosaurus marched on. This age of weird survivors lasted for millions of years. Diversity remained low, but populations of these hardy animals were large. It was a time when ecosystems were dominated not by many different species, but by a few successful ones. That imbalance wasn't sustainable forever, but it was enough to carry the Earth through its recovery. Once conditions improved, those few survivors provided the foundation for new lineages to evolve. Looking back, it's tempting to smile at the idea that such a squat, ungainly creature could be the star of its age. But survival isn't about beauty or ferocity. It's about resilience. Lista may not have been graceful, but it was persistent. And in the aftermath of the greatest extinction in history, persistence was the most valuable trait of all. The friends of Listoris, the amphibians, the small reptiles, the early cynodons, may not have dominated in the same way, but they shared that persistence. They were the background cast in a play that would eventually give rise to the stars of the later ages. Without them, there would be no crocodiles, no dinosaurs, no mammals, no humans. Their odd, modest forms carried this spark forward. The age of weird survivors wasn't flashy. It wasn't full of roaring predators or lush jungles. It was quieter, stranger, and more uniform. But it was also necessary. Without it, the long recovery might have stalled. With it, the world had the stability it needed to keep moving forward. And so the strange herds of Listosaurus and their scattered companions trudged across the Triassic landscape, symbols of endurance in a broken world. They may look odd to us, but they were exactly what Earth needed at the time. After the Great Dying, the land looked barren and repetitive. Herds of the same squat animals moved across dusty plains. Amphibians clung to shrinking wetlands, and plants remained low and patchy. But if you shifted your gaze downward to the soil, the roots, the shrubs, and the damp edges of streams, you'd see another recovery unfolding. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it was constant. The insects were crawling back, and in many ways, they were setting the stage for Earth's next chapter. Before the extinction, insects had been diverse, with giant dragonflies in the skies and a wide range of beetles, roaches and others filling every imaginable niche. The Great Dying had slashed that diversity. Many lineages disappeared completely, making it the only mass extinction known to hit insects as hard as it did vertebrates. For a time, the buzzing skies and crawling ground went quiet, but they didn't stay that way forever. Beetles, dragonflies, and a few others managed to hold on. And from those survivors came the slow rebuilding of insect life. The early Triassic was a world where insects weren't yet dominant in number, but they were dominant in function. They crawled through soils, feeding on decaying matter, cycling nutrients back into ecosystems that had been stripped of complexity. They chewed on the few plants that had managed to spread. They laid eggs in burrows and cracks, starting new generations in landscapes that still looked empty. They weren't diverse yet, but they were everywhere, quietly persistent. Beetles, in particular, were central. Their design, with hard outer wings acting as armor, gave them resilience. They could feed on almost anything from rotting plants to fungi to carrion. In a world where food was scarce, that flexibility mattered. Fossil evidence shows that beetles spread widely in the early Triassic, playing the role of recyclers in an Earth that desperately needed them. Every beetle chewing through dead material was helping to return nutrients to soils that would later support forests again. Dragonflies, though diminished, kept flying. Their Parian ancestors had reached wingspans over 2 feet. But those giants were gone. The survivors were smaller, more modest, but still recognizable. They skimmed across ponds and streams, feeding on smaller insects, keeping food chains alive. Their buzzing wings may have been one of the few sounds breaking the silence above the water. They were reminders that even after devastation, flight was possible. Flies also began to appear, filling niches as scavengers. Their quick life cycles allowed them to rebound faster than many other insects. Ants and bees, not yet evolved, would come much later, but the groundwork for those complex lineages was being laid in these early crawling recoveries. In the absence of abundance, speed and flexibility were the best strategies. It's important to remember how much insects do for ecosystems. They pollinate plants, recycle waste, aerate soils, and form the base of countless food chains. After the Great Dying, their role became even more important. With diversity so low in larger animals, insects kept basic running. They turned death into soil, soil into plants, and plants into food for larger creatures. They were the gears still turning in a machine that had nearly stopped. If you crouched in the ferns of that world, you'd see them at work. Beetles gnawing at fallen stems, dragonflies darting above pools, small larvae wriggling in damp earth. It wasn't a spectacle, but it was life in motion, and it was steady. Unlike the fragile populations of larger animals, insects reproduced quickly and in great numbers. That speed allowed them to adapt, to test new strategies, and to spread into every corner that could support them. The return of insects also meant the return of interaction. Plants and insects had long been intertwined, and though pollinating relationships were not yet as sophisticated as they would become, insects were still moving spores, chewing leaves, and shaping vegetation. Every bite and every crawl influenced which plants spread and which failed. In a world without forests, that influence was small but significant. Over millions of years, as forests returned, insects would shape them again. But even in the early stages, they were already part of the story. What makes this period so strange is how insects filled roles that had once belonged to others. In the absence of birds, skies were left to dragonflies. In the absence of abundant scavengers, beetles and flies carried the load. In the absence of complex forest ecosystems, insects dominated the undergrowth. They weren't yet as visible as the herds of reptiles, but they were everywhere, and their presence made survival for others possible. The fossil record shows their growing importance. Traces of insect feeding appear on fossil plants, showing where they chewed or bored. Their bodies are preserved in ancient sediments, sometimes in great numbers. Their rise after the extinction is slower than in other recoveries, but it's steady, building a foundation that would only grow stronger as conditions improved. If you imagine walking across the land, you'd hear little of them at first. Maybe a faint buzz, maybe the flicker of wings by a pond. But if you knelt down and looked closely, you'd see them in every patch of green and every scrap of soil. The earth was crawling again, not yet flying, not yet humming in full, but crawling. And that crawling mattered. Over time, as ecosystems regained stability, insects became more diverse again. By the Middle Triassic, new groups were appearing, building the lineages that would dominate for the rest of Earth's history. Ants, bees, butterflies, and countless others were still far in the future, but their distant ancestors were already taking shape. The crawling Earth of the early Triassic was the seedbed for the buzzing world we know today. And so, while the large survivors trudged across plains and amphibians clung to swamps, the insects were rebuilding life from the ground up. They were the quiet workers, the overlooked survivors, the creatures that turned emptiness into possibility. Their takeover was not dramatic, but it was decisive. Without them, the recovery of plants, animals, and entire ecosystems would have stalled. With them, the Earth had gears again, small, but unbreakable. The crawling Earth may not have looked impressive, but it was alive. And in that crawling, life was already preparing for the next rise. Life after the Great Dying wasn't just shaped by what was gone. It was shaped by what the Earth kept throwing at it. Survival was never smooth, because the planet itself wouldn't settle. The climate swung back and forth like a pendulum that couldn't find its balance. One stretch of years would scorch the land with heat. Another would bury it under floods. Droughts lasted long enough to crack soils wide open, and storms came fierce enough to wash away what little had grown. If extinction had left the world fragile, the climate kept pressing on that fragility, testing it over and over again. The Siberian eruptions had filled the air with greenhouse gases, and those gases lingered for millions of years. Carbon dioxide levels were far higher than today, and methane released from ocean deposits only added to the burden. That meant heat. Relentless heat. Average global temperatures rose to levels far beyond what modern Earth carries. Day after day, the sun beat down harder than before, and nights gave little relief. For animals already struggling with low oxygen, that heat made every step more exhausting. Shade was scarce, and even where plants grew, the air itself held the weight of warmth. But the heat wasn't steady. Volcanic dust and ash sometimes blocked sunlight, creating short spells of cooling. Those cool intervals may have offered temporary relief, but they came with their own problems. Crops of plants just starting to spread could fail under sudden chills. Rainfall patterns shifted wildly. What life needed most, stability, was nowhere to be found. Instead, the climate lurched between extremes, giving with one hand and taking with the other. Drought was one of the harshest challenges. Without forests to hold moisture, the land dried out quickly. Rivers shrank, wetlands vanished, and soils cracked into mosaics of dust. Amphibians, already diminished, were hit hardest. Their dependence on water made them vulnerable in a world where water came and went unpredictably. Reptiles fared better, their tougher skins keeping them from drying out. But even they struggled when food disappeared with the rains. Herds of Listostrosaurus may have wandered long distances between patches of greenery, their bodies trudging under skies that offered no relief. Then, Just as the land seemed at its driest, rains could return with fury. With soils bare and roots scarce, floods carved across the land. Torrent sets of water swept away plants and animals alike, filling rivers with mud and choking deltas with silt. Floods that would once have nourished valleys instead scoured them. For life trying to take hold, these swings were brutal. A plant that managed to grow during drought might be washed away in the flood that followed. An animal that survived a flood might starve during the drought that came next. These swings show up clearly in rocks from the early Triassic. Sediments alternate between signs of extreme dryness, desert dunes frozen in stone, and signs of flooding, thick layers of mud washed into basins. In some regions, fossil soils reveal cycles of cracking and hardening, evidence of drought after drought. Then sudden deposits of silt record the destructive power of floods. It's as if the earth was scribbling notes about its own instability, layer after layer of extremes. The roller coaster wasn't just on land. Oceans felt it too. Warmer temperatures meant less oxygen dissolved in the water, leading to repeated dead zones. Sudden cooling episodes mixed the waters in chaotic ways, sometimes bringing toxic layers to the surface. Marine life would rebound slightly during stable spells, only to collapse again when heat or stagnation returned. The seas were as unpredictable as the skies, leaving animals and plants no easy refuge. For evolution, though, these swings acted as a constant filter. Only creatures that could handle extremes survived. Specialists that required steady conditions vanished. Generalists, flexible and adaptable, became the core of recovery. That's part of why animals like Listerus thrived. They could eat a wide variety of plants, dig burrows to escape heat, and reproduce quickly. Their bodies didn't demand much from the climate, and that made them perfect for instability. The roller coaster also explains why recovery was so slow. Every time life began to stabilize, another swing knocked it back. Diversity would start to rise, then collapse again. Populations would expand, then vanish in droughts or floods. It took millions of years for the climate to settle enough that ecosystems could truly rebuild. Compared to other extinction recoveries, this one was dragged out, stretched by the Earth's refusal to find balance. If you imagine living through it, the uncertainty would be constant. One generation might know a landscape of dry winds and cracked soils. The next might be born into floods and storms. Plants would sprout only to die. Animals would migrate only to find nothing waiting. There was no rhythm to trust, no season that followed the same pattern twice. The climate was the ruler of the age, and it was mercilessly unpredictable. And yet, in that unpredictability, life still pushed forward. Ferns spread in the wake of floods, taking advantage of fresh sediments. Beetles recycled what little organic matter survived the droughts. Amphibians bred in pools that appeared after storms, even if those pools dried soon after. Survival wasn't about comfort. It was about taking every small chance the climate allowed. Over time, those small chances added up. The roller coaster eventually slowed, but not quickly. Millions of years passed before carbon dioxide levels declined enough to ease the heat. By then, evolution had tested countless strategies, discarding those that failed and holding on to those that worked. The animals and plants that emerged from this gauntlet were shaped by instability itself. They were tougher, more adaptable, and ready to build the ecosystems of the mid-Triassic. Looking back, the climate swings after the Great Dying remind us how fragile balance can be. A planet doesn't need to be stable for life to exist, but stability is what allows life to flourish. Without it, survival shrinks to its simplest forms. The early Triassic was not a time of flourishing. It was a time of endurance. Heat, drought, and rain kept the earth unsettled. But even in that turbulence, the machinery of recovery kept turning. The roller coaster would not last forever. Eventually, the pendulum would slow, the extremes would soften, and life would have the room it needed to expand again. But while it lasted, it defined everything about survival. And in its wake, Only those who could ride the swings remain to tell the story. When people hear about extinction, they often imagine that once the disaster ends, life bounces back quickly. You clear the slate, and within a few centuries, maybe a few thousand years, the world is full again. After all, life is resilient, isn't it? But the story after the Great Dying shows that resilience doesn't mean speed. The recovery was not quick. It was stretched across millions upon millions of years, long enough that entire mountain ranges rose and eroded again while life struggled to rebuild. The earth itself seemed to wait, and in that waiting evolution moved at a crawl. The sheer scale of the extinction was part of the reason. This wasn't just the loss of a few groups here and there. It was the collapse of nearly everything. In the oceans, 90% of species were gone. On land, around 70% disappeared. Ecosystems weren't just trimmed, they were leveled. And when you level something that thoroughly, there's almost nothing left to work with. Evolution needs raw material, species with variations, lineages to branch from, diversity to fuel experiments. The Great Dying left very little behind. The survivors were tough, but they were few. And from that thin base, recovery had to begin. Even the survivors struggled. Listoris may have dominated landscapes, but it wasn't building diverse ecosystems by itself. Beetles recycled, dragonflies buzzed, amphibians lurked, but there weren't enough species interacting to create stable layered systems. Everything was simple, flat, and fragile. Food chains were short, often just 2 or 3 steps, from plants to herbivores to small predators. Complexity was gone. And without complexity, resilience was low. Any disturbance could ripple through and collapse whole communities. That fragility kept life from expanding the way it normally would, and the disturbances kept coming. The climate refused to settle. Heat waves baked the land. Then sudden cooling episodes arrived when volcanic dust or ocean shifts blocked sunlight. Rain fell in destructive floods, then vanished into long droughts. Oxygen levels remained low in both air and sea, making it difficult for large animals to thrive. Acid rain stripped soils. Toxic oceans kept killing off attempts at recovery. It was as if the planet was set on repeat, knocking life down every time it tried to stand up. This stop-start pattern is written clearly in the rocks. Fossil layers show bursts of diversity rising, followed by sharp declines over and over again through the early Triassic. Insects would spread, then falter. Plants would colonize ground, then vanish in droughts. Marine animals would diversify, then crash again in oxygen-starved seas. It wasn't one long recovery curve. It was a jagged line climbing and dropping across millions of years. Only in the middle Triassic does the line finally begin to climb steadily. Another factor slowing recovery was the collapse of forests. For nearly 10 million years, the coal gap marks a time when true forest didn't exist. Without tall trees, there were no stable habitats for countless species. Birds hadn't yet evolved, but the absence of canopy life meant the skies were emptier. Rivers eroded without roots to hold them. The cycling of water through forests was gone, leaving rainfall less reliable. Life without forests is possible, but it's limited. That absence meant entire sets of niches were closed off, and until trees returned, ecosystems couldn't reach their old complexity. On land, the dominance of a few survivors slowed things too. When one species like Listerosaurus makes up 90% of the fossils in some places, that means ecosystems are incredibly lopsided. A single species dominating so heavily doesn't leave much room for variety. That kind of monopoly might keep things stable in the short term, but it delays the branching out that fuels diversity. Only when their dominance waned did other groups begin to rise. The oceans show a similar pattern. For millions of years, reefs were gone, replaced by microbial mats and sponge fields. Without reefs, marine ecosystems lost their richest habitats. Coral reefs today cover less than 1% of the seafloor, but host a quarter of marine species. Imagine stripping that away, and you can see why marine recovery lagged. Until reefs re-emerged in the Middle Triassic, the seas were simpler, flatter, and less capable of supporting variety. Time itself played a role, too. Evolution doesn't move quickly on the scale of rebuilding entire ecosystems. Even if a new species evolves in a few hundred years, it takes far longer for that species to diversify into dozens of forms, filling different roles. Multiply that across plants, insects, fish, reptiles, and you see why rebuilding takes millions of years. Evolution is inventive, but it isn't instant. The great dying had erased so much that the process couldn't be rushed. It's worth thinking about what those millions of years felt like from the perspective of living creatures. For Allosaurus, life was short and immediate. Find plants, avoid predators, raise young. They didn't know they were living in an age of slow recovery. To them, the world simply was what it was. But to us looking back, those millions of years feel like waiting. Waiting for forests to return. Waiting for reefs to grow. Waiting for predators to evolve again. Waiting for the variety of life to bloom. That waiting wasn't empty, but it was stretched so long that it feels almost frozen in time. The phrase "great wait" captures the frustration of looking at the fossil record and seeing how little seemed to change for so long. 10 million years can pass, and the diversity is still thin, the landscape still simple. Only after that span does the fossil record show real expansion, with new reptiles rising, forests spreading, insects diversifying, and oceans filling with more complex communities. It's as though the Earth pressed pause after catastrophe, and the pause lasted longer than the entire span of human existence, multiplied many times over. But the great wait was not wasted time. Evolution was still at work in the background, slowly shaping survivors into new forms. Early Aurosaurs were experimenting with body plans that would later give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. Cynodonts, those small fur-covered reptile relatives, were slowly acquiring traits that would lead toward mammals. Insects were laying the groundwork for the diversity that would eventually explode. The wait was long, but within it foundations were forming. The length of the wait also ensured that the world which emerged afterward was not a copy of the old one. The Parian world of saber-toothed predators, swampy forests, and armored fish was gone. The Triassic world that followed was new with different players, different balances, and different ecosystems. The waiting period had filtered the survivors, and those filters shaped what came next. The dinosaurs, for example, rose not in spite of the great wait, but because of it. With competitors gone and ecosystems reset, they had room to flourish. The mammals, too, owed their chance to this long pause. The great wait was painful, but it was also transformative. If you think about the span of time, it's staggering. 5 million years before reefs return. 10 million before forests re-establish. Entire eras passing with only modest steps forward. For comparison, modern humans have existed for less than 500,000 years. Everything we know, agriculture, writing, cities, technology, fits into a blink compared to the wait after the great dying. From our perspective, the pause is almost beyond comprehension. But for the Earth, it was just another cycle, another slow march of recovery measured in millions, not in moments. So the great wait wasn't emptiness. It was persistent, stretched thin, survival, playing the long game. Life held on, sometimes just barely, until the world allowed it to expand again. And when that expansion finally came, it was shaped by the filters of heat, drought, floods, and scarcity. Those who had endured became the ancestors of what was to come. The great wait explains why recovery took millions of years. But it also explains why the world that followed looked so different from the one that came before. When the great wait finally began to ease, life didn't simply return to what it had been before. The world had changed too much for that. Entire groups were gone. Climates had shifted. Oceans had been remade, and landscapes had lost their forests. What came next wasn't a restoration, but a recreation. Ecosystems rebuilt from scratch. Every piece of the puzzle had to be placed again. And in that slow rebuilding, a new balance emerged. The first signs of this rebuilding appeared in the plants. Ferns had been the quick colonizers after the extinction, spreading across bare ground like a green bandage. But over time, shrubs and small conifers began to join them. Their roots stabilized soil, their trunks offered shelter, and their seeds spread in wider patterns. Slowly, patches of vegetation grew thicker, creating islands of shade and structure in an otherwise open landscape. These patches weren't yet forests, but they were steps toward forests. In them, animals found shelter from heat. Insects found leaves to chew, and soils began to rebuild their fertility. Animals followed the plants. Herds of Listoris still dominated, but their numbers were no longer as overwhelming. Other reptiles, once minor players, began to spread into the spaces left open. Some grew larger, experimenting with new body plans. Others specialized into predators, filling roles that had been empty for millions of years. Amphibians lingered in swamps and rivers, holding on to their niche. Cynodons, small and fur-bearing, crept along the edges, feeding on insects and plants, surviving quietly but steadily. Each addition to the patchwork added new links to food chains, which slowly became more complex. The ocean showed the same story. For a long time, microbial mats and sponge fields had dominated. But now, reefs began to reappear. At first, they were small, scattered clusters of sponges and corals, fragile but functional. Around them, fish populations grew. Ammonoids diversified, and predators began to return. Sharks adapted to the new conditions, spreading into roles left empty. The seas weren't as rich as before, but they were no longer empty. Every reef that managed to hold together became a hub of life, drawing in creatures from miles around. What's striking about this rebuilding is how new it was. The old Parian ecosystems with their saber-toothed predators, dense forests, and armored fish didn't come back. Instead, the survivors gave rise to new lineages. Arazosaurs, the ancestors of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, began to rise on land. In the seas, marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs appeared, sleek and powerful in ways no earlier animals had been. The Cynod, though still small, were developing traits that would one day define mammals. The rebuilding wasn't a copy. It was an invention. The balance itself was different, too. Before the extinction, ecosystems had been dominated by certain groups, like brachipods in the seas and massive amphibians on land. Afterward, dominance shifted. Bivalves replaced brachipods as key players in the oceans. Reptiles replaced amphibians as the leading land animals. Insects, though heavily reduced at first, eventually spread back into their old roles, shaping plant life in new ways. The extinction had reset the rules, and the winners of the new game weren't the same as the old ones. This kind of rebuilding doesn't happen overnight. It takes countless small steps. A patch of plants spreads a little wider, giving animals a place to feed. A new predator evolves sharper teeth, changing the balance of prey. An insect develops a new way of feeding, influencing which plants thrive. These steps play out slowly, but together they form the architecture of new ecosystems. From simplicity, complexity began to grow again, weaving itself into food webs that could withstand the shocks of climate and time. The fossil record shows this gradual layering. Early Triassic rocks contain few species, often dominated by just one or two. Middle Triassic rocks show more variety, different reptiles, more insects, diverse fish, growing reefs. By the late Triassic, ecosystems look fully rebuilt with forests on land, thriving seas, and predators of every size. The transformation wasn't smooth, but it was real. From the great dying to the rise of dinosaurs, the Earth had gone from emptiness to abundance, step by step. One of the most fascinating parts of this rebuilding is how much it depended on survivors interacting in new ways. Lister may have kept ecosystems going at first, but its dominance created opportunities for others to adapt. When forests returned, insects expanded into pollination, influencing plant evolution. When small reptiles spread, they created prey for new predators. Each move set off another, and over millions of years, the pieces formed a new pattern. The new balance also reflects the resilience of life. Even after the worst extinction in history, life found ways to adapt, innovate, and diversify again. It didn't matter that 90% of species were gone. The 10% that remained were enough to rebuild. They weren't the same, but they were sufficient. Out of their persistence came ecosystems as rich and varied as any before. If you picture the landscapes of the Middle Triassic, you'd see the difference. Plains that had once been barren now held shrubs, trees, and herds of reptiles. Wetlands echoed with amphibian calls again. Forests, though younger and smaller than the old ones, shaded streams and sheltered insects. Skies once empty now had dragonflies and the early ancestors of flying reptiles. Seas that had been slimy and stagnant now shimmered with fish, ammonoids, and the first great marine reptiles. The Earth wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving. And yet, even in that thriving, the memory of collapse lingered. Ecosystems rebuilt from scratch are never quite the same. The scars of extinction shaped the path forward. Whole groups that once defined the Permian were gone forever, replaced by newcomers that would define the Triassic. The balance was new, fragile at first, but strong enough to last. For the next 160 million years, dinosaurs, marine reptiles, and early mammals would live in the world built during this rebuilding. The new balance wasn't temporary. It was the foundation of an era. It's humbling to realize that everything we know about life today, from the mammals that became us to the birds that fill our skies, owes its roots to that slow rebuilding. If the survivors hadn't stitched together new ecosystems, if the balance hadn't been found again, the story could have ended there. But it didn't. It paused, it restarted, and it created something new. That's what ecosystems do. They rebuild even from almost nothing given enough time. So when the Earth seemed quiet, when recovery seemed endlessly stalled, what was really happening was the construction of a new order. Plants, insects, reptiles, and microbes were all laying down the scaffolding for the future. The new balance wasn't a return to the past. It was a fresh creation, one that would support life for millions of years to come. Once ecosystems had begun to stabilize again, the stage was set for something new to emerge. The old world of the Permian had been erased, and in its place, a simpler, patchier one had taken shape. But out of that new balance came the first hints of futures still far away. Early reptiles were beginning to test out forms and strategies that would eventually define entire eras. And among them, the first true dinosaurs were just starting to appear. Small and unnoticed at first, but destined to grow into giants. These were the seeds of the future, scattered across a recovering Earth. Reptiles had been around for a long time by this point. They first appeared hundreds of millions of years earlier, but the great dying had cut many of their lineages short. The ones that remained were smaller, tougher, and more adaptable than their Permian predecessors. They scurried through the undergrowth, grazed on sparse plants, and hunted insects and small animals. They weren't yet the rulers of the land, but they were everywhere, quietly diversifying. One of the key groups to rise during this time were the Aurosaurs. These reptiles were lightly built with long legs and agile bodies, traits that set them apart from the heavier animals that had come before. They started small, no bigger than a dog, but their body plans gave them speed and efficiency. In a world of heat, drought, and unpredictable resources, being fast and adaptable was an advantage. Over millions of years, Aurosaurs would split into branches. one leading to crocodiles, another ptosaurs, and another to dinosaurs. At this early stage, though, they were simply survivors trying out new forms. Cynodonts, the reptile relatives that would one day give rise to mammals, were also spreading. They were small, often burrowing, and probably covered in fur. Their teeth show signs of specialization, with different shapes for cutting and grinding, a hint of the mammalian traits to come. They hunted insects, fed on plants, and lived in the margins. They weren't dominant, but they were persistent. Their presence shows that even in the shadow of larger reptiles, the ancestors of mammals were already adapting, waiting for their chance. But the most transformative group to emerge were the first dinosaurs. In the late Triassic, fossils begin to show small bipedal reptiles that walked on their hind legs, with light skeletons and grasping hands. They weren't the towering creatures we usually imagine when we think of dinosaurs. They were modest, perhaps the size of a large dog or a small horse, but they carried the traits that would make their descendants dominant. Speed, agility, and a body plan that allowed for a wide range of adaptations. At first, they weren't particularly special. They shared the landscape with many other reptiles, including large aurosaurs that were far more intimidating. Early dinosaurs weren't kings of the land. They were minor players, darting through forests and plains, living in the shadows of bigger predators. But evolution often works that way. The giants rule for a time, but the small and flexible endure. The seeds of the future are rarely obvious in the present. What made dinosaurs successful in the long run may have been their posture. Walking on two legs freed their forelimbs for other uses, whether grasping prey or balancing while running. Their upright stance allowed them to move more efficiently than the sprawling reptiles that dominated earlier ages. These advantages didn't make them rulers immediately, but they gave them the potential to rise when conditions allowed. The fossil record shows how gradual this rise was. In the early Triassic, dinosaurs are absent. In the middle Triassic, their earliest relatives appear small and scattered. By the late Triassic, true dinosaurs are present, still small in number, but spreading. Within a few million years, they would begin to diversify into the first recognizable groups: theropods, sauropodomorphs, and ornithischians. The diversity that would one day fill entire continents began with these small, agile creatures. It's striking to think that at this time, no one would have noticed them as future rulers. If you were standing on a Triassic plain, you'd see herds of stocky reptiles, amphibians in wetlands, early crocodile-like predators, and insects buzzing across shrubs. The small dinosaurs would blend in, one more reptile among many. Their future dominance wasn't inevitable. It was a matter of timing, adaptability, and survival. But in their bodies, the blueprint for that dominance was already present. These seeds of the future weren't limited to dinosaurs. In the seas, ichthyosaurs were evolving into powerful marine reptiles, streamlined like dolphins, but descended from land-dwelling ancestors. They became some of the top predators of their time, filling roles that had been empty since the extinction. Nothosaurs and plecodonts explored different marine niches, some sleek and fast, others armored and heavy. The oceans, like the land, were filled with experiments, some of which would last for millions of years, others of which would vanish quickly. On land, plants were also laying down the seeds of the future. Conifers spread more widely, building forests that would support larger herbivores. Seed plants diversified, creating food sources that could be stored and carried, changing the way animals fed and moved. Insects followed, adapting to new plants and beginning the long evolutionary dance that would shape both groups. Even in the undergrowth, change was stirring. The world of the Triassic was still strange compared to what came later. It wasn't yet dominated by towering dinosaurs or lush forests. But the outlines of that world were already visible. Every small aurosaur, every creeping cynodont, every sprouting conifer was part of a pattern that would expand. The Earth was no longer just recovering. It was inventing. The seeds of the future remind us how much of evolution is about patience. What looks small and unimportant in one age can become monumental in the next. The tiny fur-bearing cynodonts would eventually give rise to mammals. The small bipedal dinosaurs would grow into giants. The scattered conifers would spread into forests. The buzzing insects would diversify into millions of forms. From humble beginnings, lineages can rise to define entire eras. And so, after the silence of extinction and the long wait of recovery, the Earth was once again moving toward abundance. It wasn't the same abundance as before, but a new one carried by creatures that had been overlooked or underestimated. The seeds of the future were already planted, and in time they would grow into some of the most extraordinary forms life has ever taken. If the past could only be imagined, it would always feel uncertain. But the Earth keeps its own records, and those records are written in stone. Fossils are the notes left behind, the fragments of bodies, the impressions of leaves, the traces of movement frozen in sediments. Without them, the great dying would be a story half-guessed. With them, we can see not only what was lost, but also how life climbed back. They tell us about collapse, about waiting, about survival, and about the new balance that eventually formed. Each fossil is a sentence in the story of recovery. The earliest Triassic layers are stark. In rocks dated just after the extinction, diversity drops to nearly nothing. Whole beds of limestone that once teemed with shells are empty. Reef structures vanish, replaced by flat layers of microbial mats. On land, where there should be forests, there are instead deposits showing bare soils and ferns spreading across disturbed ground. The absence itself is a lesson. Fossils don't just tell us what lived, they also tell us what didn't. The silence in those layers speaks louder than any bone. Then as you move upward through the rock record, fragments of survivors appear. The bones of Lystrosaurus show up in abundance, scattered across riverbeds and floodplains. Their skeletons are simple, repeated again and again, evidence of how one animal came to dominate. That dominance is a lesson in its own right. It shows us that recovery doesn't always begin with variety. It can begin with a few hardy species carrying the load. Insects leave their own marks in plant fossils. Tiny chew marks, ore holes, and frills in leaves reveal that beetles and other insects were still working even when diversity was low. Those subtle traces remind us that survival isn't always about large bodies. Sometimes it's about the smallest mouths keeping ecosystems alive. The rocks also capture the instability of the time. Repeated layers of red sandstone and mudstone tell of shifting rivers and flooding plains. Ancient soils reveal cracks from drought, then layers of silt from sudden floods. Each cycle etched into stone shows how unpredictable the climate was and how life had to adapt to constant swings. Without those layers, we might think recovery failed because life was too weak. With them, we see the truth. Life was tested by forces that didn't relent for millions of years. In the seas, fossils record the slow return of complexity. Stromatolites reappear in abundance, telling us that microbial mats reclaim the seafloor. Over time, sponge fossils join them, then bivalves, then ammonoids. The order in which they appear is important. It shows the sequence of rebuilding microbes first, then simple animals, then more complex communities. By the Middle Triassic, coral-like organisms begin to show up again, proof that reefs were returning. Without fossils, we would never know how gradual that sequence was. The story would seem too neat. Fossils reveal the unevenness, the long pauses, and the fragile first steps. Trace fossils, tracks, burrows, and trails are just as valuable as bones. They show us how animals move through these recovering landscapes. Burrows attributed to Lystrosaurus tell us they dug into the earth, perhaps to escape heat or drought. Trackways left by early reptiles show their shift to more upright stances, evidence of evolutionary experiments in posture and movement. Even faint impressions of amphibians in mud tell us where wetlands still existed. Fragile but persistent. These traces are like snapshots of behavior, letting us see not just what animals were, but what they did to survive. Chemical fossils add another layer. Certain isotopes in rocks reveal when oceans were low in oxygen, when carbon dioxide spiked, and when volcanic activity altered the atmosphere. These chemical signatures line up with fossil diversity, confirming that swings in climate match swings in life. They remind us that biology and geology are inseparable, that the Earth itself is both stage and actor in this story. Without those chemical records, we might underestimate the environmental stress life was under. With them, we see just how stacked the odds were against recovery. Every fossil from this time carries weight because of what it represents. A single ammonoid shell in a Triassic layer tells us that lineage survived and began to spread again. A fragment of a conifer cone tells us forests were returning. A tiny cynodon jaw tells us the ancestors of mammals were already taking their first steps. Each piece is small, but together they show a larger picture. It's like piecing together a mosaic where most of the tiles are missing. The image isn't complete, but enough remains to see the shape of the story. Fossils also remind us of the unevenness of recovery across the world. In some regions, diversity returns sooner. In others, it lagged for millions of years. For example, marine life in certain basins shows earlier signs of ammonoid recovery, while other seas stay dominated by microbes for longer. On land, some regions show forests reappearing earlier, while others remained open plains. These differences tell us recovery wasn't a single global wave, but a patchwork. Conditions varied, and life responded differently in each place. That lesson is important. It shows that recovery is local before it is global. The value of fossils lies not just in what they show, but in how they connect us to time. Holding a Listoris skull or a stromatolite fragment is to touch survival itself, carried across 250 million years. They are physical evidence that life endured, that the silence of extinction was not complete. They let us see the faces of survivors and the steps of recovery in a way imagination alone cannot. Without fossils, the great dying would be a myth. With them, it is a history written in detail, however incomplete. It's also humbling to realize how much of what we know comes from chance. Fossilization is rare. Most creatures vanish without a trace. What we do have is a fraction of a fraction, preserved only because conditions are lined, a bone buried in the right sediment, a leaf trapped in the right mud, a shell covered before it could be crushed. The fact that we can reconstruct recovery at all is remarkable. It's a reminder of how much is missing, but also of how much can be learned from what remains. The lessons written in stone are not just about the past. They speak to the present, too. They show us how fragile ecosystems can be, how long recovery takes after collapse, and how important survivors are in rebuilding. They warn us that even resilient life has limits, and that stability is rare and precious. They also remind us that extinction is not just an end, but a beginning of something new. The fossil record doesn't just tell us what was lost. It tells us how the Earth reinvented itself. So when we look at bones, shells, tracks, and chemical signatures, we're not just cataloging relics. We're reading the story of persistence, written in the language of stone. That story is long, fragmented, and patient. And in it, we find the memory of the great dying, not just as a collapse, but as a recovery told one fossil at a time. The great dying was not just an event that ended and then vanished from the record. Its echo lingers in the earth itself, in stone, in air, in oceans, in the very shape of the history that followed. Extinction on that scale doesn't leave quietly. It imprints itself in ways that ripple forward for millions of years, long after the last direct victims have turned to dust. To study the Triassic and everything that followed is to hear those echoes, faint but persistent, shaping the world that came after the rocks remember most clearly. Geologists reading through layers of sediment see the sharp break between the late Permian and early Triassic. Fossil beds rich with shells and bones give way to barren strata where diversity collapses into near silence. Coal beds once come and disappear, marking the loss of forests. In their place are sediments filled with red oxides and cracked mudstones, the scars of drought and bare landscapes. Even without fossils, the rocks alone show something extraordinary happened. That gap, that sudden absence, is one of the loudest echoes the earth holds. Chemical signatures in stone are just as telling. Ratios of carbon isotopes swing wildly across the boundary, evidence of massive disruptions to the carbon cycle. Sulfur isotopes reveal the spread of toxic low-oxygen seas. Traces of mercury locked in sediments point to the vast volcanic eruptions of Siberia, which poured greenhouse gases and ash into the air. Every chemical imbalance preserved in stone is a reminder of the environmental chaos that followed the eruptions. The Earth keeps those imbalances as records like scars written in its chemistry. The echo also lingers in the long pause that followed. For nearly 10 million years, life remained stunted. Fossil layers show repetition rather than expansion, with the same few species appearing again and again. That lack of diversity itself is an echo. It tells us that extinction doesn't simply erase the past. It reshapes the future by slowing it down. The Great Wait was the Earth's way of remembering, of carrying forward the consequences of collapse in every bare plain, every empty reef, every simplified food chain. Even the survivors carry the memory in their bodies. Listaurus, so abundant after the extinction, is itself an echo. Its overwhelming presence in the fossil record reflects the vacuum left by others. Every skull, every bone bed is a reminder of how narrow survival had become. The dominance of baths in the oceans replacing brachipods is another echo. Brachipods had been the backbone of marine ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. Their failure to recover after the Great Dying shows how extinction can permanently shift the balance of life. Their absence still shapes seas today. The echo is also in the lineages that rose only because others had fallen. Arasaurs, which would later give rise to crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds, flourished in the space left open by vanished competitors. Mammal ancestors, once minor players, survived in burrows and shadows, carrying traits that would one day spread into whole new forms. The dominance of dinosaurs in the Mesozoic wasn't inevitable. It was an echo of the Great Dying, the result of an empty stage that only they could fill. The extinction shaped not only the end of the Permian, but the trajectory of everything that came after. The oceans carry their own memory. For millions of years, reefs were absent, and their return was slow. The gap in reef building is an echo of collapse, preserved in the lack of limestone structures during that time. Even when reefs came back, they were different. Corals eventually took over as the main builders, replacing groups that had once defined reefs. That change was permanent. It shows how extinctions echo not just in absence, but in transformation. What is lost can alter what places it, setting the path of ecosystems for ages to come. The echo also speaks through the lessons it leaves for us. The slow recovery after the Great Dying shows how fragile ecosystems can be. Once they collapse, they don't snap back quickly. It takes millions of years for complexity to rebuild. That warning echoes into our present. We can see it in fossil records, in chemical signatures, in the scars of landscapes that once lay bare. It tells us that recovery is not guaranteed, and that stability is rare and precious. Even today, scientists can detect remnants of that time in deep sea sediments, in isotope ratios that mark the swings of ancient climates, in the enduring patterns of survival and extinction across lineages. The echo is faint, but it's still there, whispering that Earth has been through collapse before, and that collapse left marks that never fully fade. It's striking to realize that echoes don't just belong to the past. They shape what we know now. The dominance of dinosaurs, the rise of mammals, the very structure of ecosystems today, all carry the imprint of what was lost. Every forest, every reef, every food chain is built on a foundation altered by that event. In that sense, we're all part of the echo. The lives of humans, the presence of birds, the spread of mammals. All of it is tied to the survival and reshaping that followed the Great Dying. The Earth remembers in ways we can measure, in stone, in chemistry, in lineages. But it also remembers in ways that are harder to define. In the shape of resilience, in the pattern of survival, in the stubborn persistence of life through instability. The echo of extinction is not just absence. It is persistence marked by absence. It is the long shadow cast forward by collapse. And as long as we read the rocks and the fossils, that echo continues to speak. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. We've walked across barren plains, peered into oceans covered in microbial gnats, watched herds of strange survivors trudge through dust, and seen the first dinosaurs take their tentative steps. We followed the long silence after the Great Dying, the fragile return of insects, the instability of climate, and the slow rebuilding of ecosystems into something new. Together, we've traced how Earth remembers catastrophe in stone and in life, how every survivor became part of the future, and how even the smallest creatures carried the weight of recovery on their backs. When you step back from all of it, the story isn't just about destruction. It's about persistence. The extinction was vast, almost total, but it wasn't the end. The world didn't stop. It paused. It stumbled. It struggled through heat and drought and storms, but it never stopped. Life endured, not because it was grand or perfect, but because it was stubborn. Beetles gnawed, microbes thrived, borrowers dug, and from those quiet actions, the future grew. It reminds us that survival isn't always about strength or speed or size. Sometimes it's about simply carrying on, even when conditions make that almost impossible. It's easy to see the Great Dying as distant, as something that happened hundreds of millions of years ago and doesn't touch us. But in truth, we live in its shadow. Every bird you see in the sky, every mammal in a field, every forest you walk through owes its existence to those survivors. Their persistence shaped the path that led to us. We are part of that story, an echo of their endurance. When you look at the world around you, you're also looking at the outcome of their survival. And that perspective changes how we think about our own time. We know the Earth can go through collapse. We know it can take millions of years to recover. We know that extinction leaves marks that never fade. That knowledge doesn't have to be frightening. It can also be grounding. It tells us that the living world we see now is rare and fragile and worth holding on to. We are one of the few generations to know the past this clearly and to understand our own role in the future. That makes the lesson of the Great Dying not just history, but guidance. So if you found this journey interesting, or even a little soothing, you can support it by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with someone who enjoys unwinding with these kinds of stories. It helps more than you might think, and it means I can keep exploring Earth's history with you, piece by piece, in the same calm way. And now, as we close, take a moment to breathe. Think about how far back this story stretches, and how patient the Earth has been. Hundreds of millions of years, entire ages passing, and yet here you are listening. The story of recovery after the Great Dying is long, but it shows that even after collapse, there can be continuity. That thought can be a soft place to rest. So wherever you are, whether you're listening at night or in the middle of the day, let this be a gentle pause. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for letting Earth's story keep you company. Until next time, may your own world feel steady, and may you drift comfortably like the survivors once did through whatever comes next.